about 45 minutes in length. And after the presentation, that's kind of when, if you want to hang around, you could also just come and go whenever you want. But after the presentation, that's when I'll open it up to any questions anyone has for Phil, or if they just want to start some discussions, about the topic. That'll be some time for that. Depending on how it goes, we might break it up as like, well, if you guys want to ask Phil some questions directly, you can ask him. And then if you guys just want to kind of discuss some topics and hang around for a bit, we can do that also. But the bulk of the time tonight will be the presentation. So hopefully everyone enjoys that. And just make sure that your mics are muted during the presentation, so Phil doesn't have any distractions. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Phil, do you want to just get started?
Sure. How do I show my screen here?
All right, so the green button at the bottom of your screen.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
Um,
And you'll click that, and then you'll just share desktop.
okay. Are you guys seeing the PowerPoint?
Yep.
Good. All right, hold up.
And then you just present, and you should be good.
Do you guys seeing that all right?
Yep.
All right,
Okay.
cool. So yeah, I guess I'll go like, what, 45 minutes max?
Yeah, around that time.
Okay.
And just so everyone knows that, just try not to, make sure your mics are muted during the presentation. And I know you'll probably have a lot of thoughts during the presentation, so take notes. If you want a question to ask Phil, take notes, because like I said, we're going to wait till the end to ask any questions or have any discussion. So just so you guys know.
All right, so I guess we'll start. So this PowerPoint is really just an introduction. I mean, I've been reading some of the applied ethics and philosophical literature on abortion for the past year, and even after all the articles I've read, all the videos I've watched, all the debates I've seen, I still haven't even scratched the surface of this debate. I think I saw a statistic that there's been more articles published on the topic of abortion than pretty much any other thing in applied ethics. So there's just so much to cover with this. But I hope tonight I can just give a little introduction to the philosophical arguments, both for and against abortion. I'll be honest, I am pro-life, but I'm hoping not to present a biased presentation tonight. I'm hoping to give both arguments for and against, and really see what you guys think of the arguments, and hopefully we can have a good discussion. So I'm going to fly through some of these slides just for the interest of time, but I'll take my time on some of the other slides that I think are worth exploring more. So I just want to start off with a quote from the Hippocratic Oath. This is an oath that was attributed to Hippocrates in 400 BC time frame. And basically, this was an oath that many doctors would swear by after they graduated from medical school throughout the years. And basically, one part of it says that I will never give a deadly drug to anybody if asked for it, nor will I make a suggestion to this effect. One second. Similarly, I will not give to a woman an abortive remedy. So it's kind of interesting. Even back then, some people saw that there may be issues with abortion. It might not be moral because, again, it made its way into the Hippocratic Oath. And I'm hoping today to kind of show some of the modern day reasons why people think abortion is moral or is not moral. So yeah, let's see. So the first thing we're going to talk about some preliminaries. I'm just going to define abortion. Although this isn't a scientific presentation on abortion, I'm going to have to present some scientific facts because they're relevant to the philosophical debates. And then I'm also going to talk about just what makes a good philosophical argument or a bad one, and what's the purpose of them, and what are the purpose of objections as well. So after we get through part one, we have part two, which is the actual arguments. So what are the theories on the wrongness of killing? What makes it wrong to kill someone or something? And there's different views on that, believe it or not. Some people say, well, what makes it wrong to kill you is if you're a human being. if you're, a member of a certain species, right? All human beings are members of the species Homo sapiens. So you might say it's wrong to kill someone if they're a human being. And we're going to look at a handful of arguments that have been put forth for that position. Then we're going to look at a second view that says, no, it's not a human being that matters. It's this other thing called personhood. You have to have a personhood property for it to be wrong to kill you. And we're going to look at people, different people who argue for and against the infant having personhood. Peter Singer and Michael Tooley, they argue that the fetus does not have personhood, so it's not wrong to kill the fetus. While Alexander Pruss says the fetus does have personhood, so it's wrong to kill them. And then lastly, we're just going to look at arguments that don't even hinge upon personhood or being a human being. So there's a whole handful of those arguments, and those are really some of the best arguments in my opinion. So we're going to look at all those too. So let's move along. So the first thing we want to do is just define abortion. Really, I just want to clarify that some people, they get mistaken. They don't understand that there's something called spontaneous abortion, and there's something called a procured abortion. A spontaneous abortion is a miscarriage. And so tonight, when we're talking about abortion, we're not talking about miscarriages. We're talking about a procured abortion. What's a procured abortion? Really, it's the deliberate termination of a human pregnancy. So that's what we're going to be discussing tonight. We're not talking about miscarriages or anything else. We're talking about the deliberate termination of a human pregnancy. So I guess I'll just discuss briefly different types of abortions. Basically, there's a medical abortion where you can get up until 7 weeks of gestation. This is where you take a combination of drugs. So, for example, methotrexate is a drug that prevents the embryo from implanting into the uterine lining. And misoprostol is a drug that expels fetal tissue, that basically encourages the removal of fetal tissue from the womb. And then after 7 weeks, but about up to 16 weeks, what a doctor can do is they could do something called a vacuum aspiration abortion. And that's basically where they use a suction device to remove the fetus and the placenta out of the uterus. Now, after 14 weeks of gestation, doctors would usually perform what's called a D&E, or a dilation and evacuation. And this is a 2-day procedure where basically the first day the doctor will widen the cervix, and the second day the doctor will actually go in and with forceps and instruments and tools to actually remove different parts of the fetus and to scoop it out. These are a little less rare, but they do occur, and they're a little more, I guess, bloody, could you say, than the vacuum aspiration or the medical abortion. And then lastly is the induction abortion. And this would only occur after 24 weeks when the baby's just too large for aspiration, for suction. And this is basically where they would give you medicine to induce labor, and you would give, prematurely, you would, conceive the infant, and they either just let it die, or they kill it right there as it's been expelled from the uterus. And those are very rare abortions, but they do happen. So for example, New York recently passed a law that says third trimester abortion. So after 24 weeks, you can have abortions. And so the method that they'd be using in that case would be this induction abortion. So, okay, just a few statistics from a bioethics book that I've been reading. Basically, 35 out of 1,000 women globally in 2010 to 2024 had abortions. And I thought what's really interesting is that 88% of all abortions in the world are done in developing countries. So that's something to consider, that really how we view abortion and what we say in the United States can really affect other countries, especially developing countries. So that's something to consider. Also, in this book, they mentioned the top reasons why women have abortions. And the top reasons given in a study in the US were having a child would interfere with education, work, or the ability to care for someone else, or not being financially able to afford having a child, or even just not wanting to be a single mother or having relationship problems. Maybe the mother has issues with the father, and they just don't want to raise the child together, something like that. But these were the top reasons given in a study. So now we're going to look at some of the scientific considerations for that might be relevant to the abortion debate. So back in the 1960s, all the human embryology books were pretty much consistent that at fertilization, that's when you have the initiation of a new life of an individual. So they say embryologists have said that it's at fertilization. It's not 24 weeks later. It's not a day later. It's at fertilization. When the sperm meets the egg, you have a new individual life. If you look at books in the 70s, it was the same thing. So here's a book on obstetrics. It says, at procreation is when a new living being develops. So, some people might wonder, oh, well, is the fetus alive? Is it a human being? Is it a new individual? And so far, there's been almost no scientist to deny that, yes, it is a living human being. It is, it's not canine, it's not feline, it's human, and it is alive, and it is a distinct individual. Moving on, here's another book on human embryology. It says a new genetically distinct human organism is formed at fertilization. So again, the consensus still moving forward is that fertilization marks the beginning of each of us as a unique individual. So I think I have one more book. So yeah, here's a book from 2019, medical embryology book that you would see in medical school textbooks. Development begins with fertilization. So it's really not a question to scientists when life begins or when a new human being is considered to exist. So, and I think what's really interesting is I read this paper, "When Does Life Begin? A Scientific Perspective," and this scientist and philosopher was talking about how scientists actually define when a new life begins, when a new individual is formed, because you might wonder, how exactly does that work? Well, the first criteria that has to be met is when you're considering, is there a new life? You have to ask, well, is there distinct material composition? So, for example, the sperm and the egg, they have their own material compositions. They're made up of 23 chromosomes. But when you have an embryo, when the sperm and egg unite, you have an embryo. And now you have 46 chromosomes, which a different arrangement, and this produces and passes the first criteria. So an embryo does have a distinct material composition. So that's one of the criteria to determine whether you have a new individual, and the embryo meets that. The second criteria that you have to meet is, does this thing in question have a distinct pattern of behavior? So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, if you look at the egg and sperm, if you just leave them alone, they're just going to die. They're not going to thrive or flourish or develop into any new organism on their own. But once they come together, and once you have an embryo, the embryo does have now a distinct pattern of behavior. It will continue to grow if left unhindered. So the embryo does meet these two criteria, which determine whether a new individual is brought into life. And that's why at the conclusion of this paper, this author says, based on scientific description of fertilization, fusion of sperm and egg in the moment of conception generates a new human cell, the zygote, with composition and behavior distinct from that of either gamete. A gamete is a sex cell. It's either sperm or egg. And then further, she continues her conclusion. She says, thus, the scientific evidence supports the conclusion that a zygote is a human organism, and that the life of a new human being commences at a scientifically well-defined moment of conception. This conclusion is objective, consistent with factual evidence, and independent of any specific ethical, moral, political, or religious view on human life or human embryos. And this is pretty much conceded by all proponents for or against abortion in the debate. So Peter Singer, as we'll see his arguments later, he's in favor of abortion, but he'll just straight up admit in his book, for example, Practical Ethics, that he says there is no doubt that from the first moments of existence, an embryo conceived from human sperm and eggs is a human being. So even the very opponents of abortion will concede this much, that the scientific evidence is strong that uh, the embryo marks the beginning of a new human being. Also, David Boonin, he's probably one of the most foremost defenders of abortion. He also, in his book, A Defense of Abortion, will just admit that on page 20, he says a human fetus, after all, is simply a human being at a very early stage in his or her development. So this is all cool, right? Okay, the scientists agree this is when life begins. So doesn't that end the debate? Not so fast, David Boonin says. He says, now, just because we say the embryo is a new human individual, or it's something that's living, that doesn't necessarily mean that this individual has a right to life. So we could admit that it's a human, that it's alive, but does that mean that it has a right to life? And that's where the debate is. Does the embryo have a right to life? And now that the science can't answer that question. That's a question we have to move beyond science into the philosophical and applied ethics arena to answer that question. So I think in the interest of time, I'll skip this, but so another scientific consideration, some other scientific considerations you might think are important are, when does, for example, the fetal heartbeat begin? Some people might say, oh, when the heartbeat starts for the fetus, that's when it's wrong to that's when it would be wrong to have an abortion. Well, according to the science, it's at the 4th week of gestation that the heartbeat of an embryo begins. Furthermore, some people might ask, well, maybe brain activity is really what matters. Maybe once the fetus exhibits brain activity, then it's wrong to kill the fetus. But that also begins fairly early, around 6 weeks. But someone might say, okay, well, maybe it's when the whole brain forms. That's when it matters. But that occurs around the 9th week of gestation. And lastly, some people might say, well, okay, well, when is the embryo, when is the fetus sentient? When can it feel pain and pleasure? When does it have some level of consciousness? And that's not much later, until 24 weeks of gestation. This is when they can feel pain as well. But I think, as you'll see in the philosophical arguments that are coming up, none of them really hinge upon any of the scientific considerations I just mentioned. They don't hinge upon heartbeat. They don't hinge upon brain activity. They don't hinge upon being able to feel pain or pleasure. It's pretty much, as you'll see, not so much dependent on these scientific facts. So before we get into the arguments, I just want to make a point about arguments. I'm going to be presenting like a slew of arguments, and how those are presented is you have a premise, conclusion. So for example, you might, I'll present just an example right here. I might say premise 1, if you are reading this, then you aren't illiterate. Premise 2, you are reading this. Conclusion, therefore you aren't illiterate. So what's interesting about arguments is, if you put them in the right form, if you put them in the right, what philosophers call logically valid form, then if you say premise 1 is true, and you say premise 2 is true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. It has to also be true. So the reason why I mention this is because I see a lot of people, when we present philosophical arguments to them, they'll say, yeah, I agree with premise 1, I agree with premise 2, but I deny premise 3, the conclusion. But that just can't happen. That's just not possible given logic. Given logic, if the arguments are in the proper form and all the premises are true, then the conclusion also has to be true. So if I present to you guys an argument today that says something like, therefore, abortion is okay or morally permissible, you can't just deny that conclusion. You have to say, okay, well, actually, Phil, the problem with your argument is premise 1, and here are good reasons why I think that premise 1 is false. You can't just say, oh, the conclusion's false, even though I agree with the premises. So, all right. So yeah, so I mean, what's the purpose of arguments even to begin with? I think arguments kind of have a connotation of like arguing, or some kind of bad connotation. But in philosophy, it's nothing. It's not like, oh, I got in an argument with my sister or something like that. It's arguments are supposed to be ways that we can sort of non-biasly approach a topic and determine whether one side or the other is correct or more likely to be true than not. And so I think a lot of times in the popular level discussions on abortion, we make really faulty arguments, or we don't really make arguments at all. On both sides of the debate, they're just caricatures of the other person's opponent thrown out, and really sort of non-argument assertions are made a lot of the time. So, for example, one of those is like someone from the pro-life side might just say, "Well, abortion is murder," and that kind of, you know, that might be true, but if you're arguing with someone who disagrees with you, you have to prove that. You have to give reasons why you think it's murder. There's a disagreement here between you and them. They don't think that it's murder. So just saying, well, abortion's murder, therefore it's wrong, that's not an argument. You have to explain why. You have to give reasons why. Someone might say abortion's killing babies, or a good person would never have an abortion, or adoption is always better than abortion. And again, none of those are arguments. Those are all just sort of statements that in philosophy, what we say is that it begs the question. What does that mean? It means that you're assuming the conclusion of an argument without sort of providing any premises or any sort of substance to substantiate the conclusion. But likewise, on the pro-choice side, some people might say, well, abortion is a personal choice, or women have a moral right to have abortions, or they have the right to do what they want with their bodies, or abortion is healthcare. None of that's really helpful to yell at somebody, right? If you want someone to consider your position, you're going to have to give them reasons and argue to that conclusion. You can't just give it. Okay, so now let's actually move to the substance of tonight's discussion. So these are theories on the wrongness of killing. This is really where you're going to see the philosophical arguments. We're asking the question here: what makes it wrong to kill anyone or anything to begin with? Or who or what has a right to life? So you might just think to yourself right now, like, yeah, like why do I intuitively think it's wrong to go kill anyone at all? Like why? Well, some people have answered this and said, well, I know what makes it wrong to kill somebody. It's it'd be wrong to kill someone because they're human beings, and human beings are intrinsically valuable or worthy or sacred or something like that. Human beings have a sacredness, and that kind of brings us to our first argument against abortion. So this is often the argument given by religious people in favor or against abortion, should I say. This argument goes like this. Premise one: the fetus is a human life from the moment of its conception. Premise two: every human life is sacred. Premise three: if the life of an individual is sacred, then the individual has a right to life. And then the conclusion: the fetus has a right to life from the moment of its conception. So what do we make of an argument like this? You might say that premise one is obviously true given the scientific data that I presented earlier. So that doesn't seem to be a reasonable premise to deny if you're going to attack this argument. But what about premise two? It seems like, for example, like I'm a Christian, and I'm sure many of you here are Christians, and I think we would all agree, or many of us would agree, that human life is sacred. And you might think, why? Well, you might say, well, we're all created in the image of God. We all have a certain special relationship with God. We're all valued by God. Christ died for every human being. And that kind of confers upon a sacredness to human life, which also gives somebody, an individual, a right to life. Now, what's interesting about this argument is it's not really going to be convincing to somebody who's not religious, right? So if you don't believe that you're made in the image of God, if you don't believe that Christ died for you, has a special relationship to all human beings, why even think premise two is true, right? A pro-choice advocate might just completely deny premise two and say this isn't a good argument. So I'm not saying that it is or isn't a good argument, but what I want to do with all these arguments I present is also present a possible objection to them. Now, I'm not saying these objections are good or bad. I'll leave you to decide whether you think the objections are good or bad, but I thought to be as fair as possible, I'd present the objections, at least one for each argument. Now, I think where this argument might work is if maybe you are Christian, but you don't think abortion is wrong. Then this argument might be something to chew on, because if you agree that people are made in the image of God, if you agree that human life is sacred, and you agree with the science that the fetus is a human life, you're going to need to kind of have a response to this argument. This might push you in the opposite direction to say, you know what, maybe if I'm trying to be as non-biased as possible, given my Christian convictions, I would have to say abortion is wrong. I think also what's interesting is there's a gentleman named David Jones, and he kind of looked at all the history of Christians who ever spoke on abortion from the early church times up until the 19th century. And he said, this is a quote from his book, says, the constant and consistent Christian tradition from the early church to the 19th century repudiated abortion at any stage of pregnancy. And he says, this is certainly a noteworthy phenomenon. It provides an important historical context for a Christian or for someone sympathetic to the spirit of Christianity who is reflecting on the ethical status of the embryo. So again, if you are a Christian, but you don't believe abortion is wrong, you're going to need to give reasons why the entire church from the early church to the 19th century has been wrong on their maybe interpretations of scripture or understanding of the human sacredness of life. So really, I think this is a good argument maybe for someone who is a Christian, who doesn't believe abortion is wrong, but not necessarily a good argument for a non-Christian. So moving on to our next argument, this is called the argument from social justice against abortion, and this is also a human being view. So again, the human being view says it's wrong to kill someone in virtue of them being a human being. The first premise goes like this: it's never morally permissible to act against social justice. What is social justice? Well, Christopher Kaiser, he says it's to deny protection to or intentionally harm the most vulnerable, helpless, and disadvantaged human beings. And then his premise too says this: well, fetuses are among the most vulnerable, helpless, and disadvantaged human beings. They're unable to voice their protest of being killed. They're unable to defend themselves in any way. And they're unable to mobilize others to support their cause. And then he says, so, premise 3 is abortion is an act against social justice. It denies protection to and intentionally harms a prenatal human being. So he says, therefore, abortion is never morally permissible. So this is an interesting argument. But I think two objections that we might be able to give against this is, as you'll see later, some people aren't persuaded that being a human being, a disadvantaged human being, has any moral relevancy. They might say, no, there's something, it's not being a human being that matters, it's having this other thing called personhood, which we'll talk about later. That's really what matters. So they might just deny premise 1 and say, it's not wrong to intentionally harm disadvantaged human beings. It's wrong to intentionally harm disadvantaged persons. And we'll see the distinction between human beings and persons a little bit later, but that might be one objection to this. Or another objection is maybe just the conclusion's too strong. Maybe abortion is never morally permissible, just is a conclusion we would want to avoid. Maybe there are times where the mother's life is in jeopardy, where we would want to save the mother's life and have the abortion. So that might be another way to object to this argument. All right, the third argument from human beings, from the human being view, is called the argument from the intentional harm of innocent human beings. This is again by Christopher Kaiser. He says, actions that intentionally kill innocent human beings are never morally permissible. That's his first premise. Second premise is the act of abortion intentionally kills innocent human beings. Therefore, abortion is never morally permissible. So this is very similar to the last argument. And I think all the objections to the last argument also apply to this argument. You might say, I just deny premise 1. I don't think actions that intentionally kill innocent human beings are never morally permissible. I think maybe there's greater goods involved. Maybe in the case of abortion, there's so much financial burden on the mother that that outweighs the moral impermissibility of killing a human being or something like that, And again, all those personhood considerations would matter for this argument as well. Okay, the last argument by Christopher Kaiser is called the history of exclusion against abortion. So he says basically this. He says, look, it's never permissible to divide human beings into human beings who have basic rights and human beings who don't have basic rights. So he says, look at history. Look at all the times we've done that in history. He says, look at racism. He says, with racism, one race of human beings excluded another race of human beings from having basic rights. Look at sexism. One group of human beings, men, excluded women from having basic human rights. Classism, the rich exclude the poor. Religious exploitation, a religious majority excludes a religious minority. Slavery, a slave owner declares that he has basic human rights, but excludes his slaves from those same basic rights. So Kaiser is really pointing out here that given history, every single time that we have tried to divide the human race into people who have rights and people who don't have rights, we've made a terrible, terrible mistake. It was a horrible decision, and we shouldn't have done that. Yeah, you might also think social discrimination. Heterosexuals might exclude homosexuals from basic human rights, right? So moving on to premise 2, he says basically to deny human rights to a prenatal human being is to divide human beings into those human beings who have basic rights and those human beings who do not have basic rights. To simplify this, the premise 2 is just basically saying, look, we agree that the fetus is a human, but you're saying that these humans, fetuses, don't have human rights, but that these other groups of humans, adults, etc., have human rights. And he says that's the same, basic error that we made in all these other cases throughout history, and every single time it just turned out to be a mistake. So his conclusion is, therefore, it's never morally permissible to deny basic human rights to prenatal human beings. The act of abortion denies that. Therefore, it's never morally permissible to get an abortion. So yeah, I think I'll save the objections for this one later, but maybe we can discuss this one afterwards if we have time, or maybe next time if I come back. Okay, and the last argument from the human being view on the against abortion is called the parsimony argument against abortion. Basically, this is an argument that David Boonin, who is actually a defender of abortion, he puts this argument this way. He says, look, suppose I ask you to go out and round up 10 individuals that both defenders of abortion and critics of abortion could all agree. These are people that have a right to life. These are people that it'd be wrong to just kill them. He says, what do you think everyone would come back and show us? Would they show us rocks? Some people show us plants. Some people show us dirt. No, it seems every single person that we would ask would come back and show us human beings, right? They'd show 10 human beings. And so the parsimony argument then asks us this. Okay, so then what makes the best sense of that? In virtue of what property do these 10 individuals have a right to life? What's the simplest explanation to explain why we would all go out and pick 10 human beings and not rocks and not animals and not dirt? What would make sense of this? And so what the first premise says is that the best explanation of that is that just being a human being is what gives you a right to life. Being a human being, being a member of the species Homo sapiens, that's what confers upon you a right to life. So the first premise would say, generally, someone or something has a right to life in virtue of that someone or something being a member of the species Homo sapien. Premise 2, fetuses are members of the species Homo sapiens, as we saw with the scientific considerations earlier. So premise 3, therefore, it's wrong to kill fetuses. Now, this is an interesting argument, but I think it's subject to some interesting objections that we should consider. If we're really going to say that it's wrong to kill human beings, that it's wrong to kill someone just in virtue of them being a human being, we might want to ask then, well, okay, what if aliens, I know this is kind of a crazy hypothetical, but what if aliens from another planet or something came to Earth and they were presumably peaceful and innocent? What would make it wrong to kill them? I would imagine we would all say, yeah, it'd be wrong to just kill them for no reason. So, I mean, they're not humans. What makes it wrong to kill them? It seems like this human being view doesn't allow us to say that it'd be wrong to kill someone like an alien. Or also, maybe here's an even crazier hypothetical situation. What if God gave us the power to kill angels? Would it be wrong to kill angels? I think so. But why? They're not humans. They're not human beings. So it just seems like this human being view isn't going to cover all the possible areas of why it would be wrong to kill someone or something. Again, I'm not saying these are good or bad objections. I'm just presenting them, and I leave you to decide whether you think these are good or bad. So now we're going to move on now to away from the human being view. We're going to view now the personhood view. Now, these defenders say, no, the human being view is just not explanatory. It doesn't explain much. It's the only way to defend it is if you're some kind of Christian who believes in the sanctity of life. Really, the human being view is bankrupt. It doesn't account for aliens, why it's wrong to kill aliens. It doesn't account why it's wrong to kill angels. It doesn't account for anencephalic newborns or cortically dead infants. So what are anencephalic newborns? You can see on the right a picture of one. These are infants that are born without most parts of their brain. They usually don't survive very long. They usually they will never develop any sort of consciousness. They will never develop any language, or they won't even be able to feel pain or anything. And personhood proponents, they'll usually say, well, look, if you believe in the sanctity of human life and that the human being view is what confers upon someone a right to life, then you'd have to agree that there's this you'd have to agree that anencephalic infants should be kept alive at all costs. You'd have to say that we have an obligation to treat them medically, spend as much money as possible to keep them alive as long as possible, even though they're just going to die eventually, and they'll never develop into persons, they'll never develop into a conscious being, they'll never develop into something that has pain or pleasure or anything like that. And so the personhood proponent says, that just seems really weird for the human being view. That just doesn't seem right. Something's wrong about that. Or for example, if let's say I get, God forbid, I get in a car accident tomorrow and I hit certain parts of my brain that reduce my consciousness permanently. Say I'm permanently brain dead or something. I'm in a vegetative state. Well, if you hold to this human being view, you might have to say, well, we should do everything in our power to hook me up to machines and just keep my heart beating and my lungs going. And, no matter how much it costs the government or the hospital or the family to keep that human being alive on this machine, we should do it because human life is sacred, and it confers upon someone a right to life. The personhood proponents, they say, no, that's crazy. We can't expect that burden. We can't put that burden on people who have family members that are in vegetative states. That's not. They think that's just something that is implausible from the human being view. And then last thing, the personhood proponents would say, the human being view is an example of what's known as speciesism. Speciesism is the view that one species is better, superior, or has greater rights than another group of species. And personhood proponents say, if you take the human being view of the right to life, you are basically saying human beings are better than other members, other species, other animals, other beings in the world. And they think that's implausible. And they would say, look, we reject racism and sexism because they rest on some biology, some biological, but not morally relevant characteristic. We're trying to find what is the morally relevant characteristic. So that's where the personhood view comes into play. It says, look, we have a view that doesn't have any of these problems listed out on this bullet point, and here it is. This is the view by Peter Singer and Michael Tooley. Their personhood view says this: personhood is the ability for someone to be self-conscious and self-aware, and to be aware of that they have a past and a future. They're capable of having desires about their future. So that's what confers upon someone a right to life. If you're self-conscious, self-aware, and you have desires about the future, not this human being view. This human being view has so many problems. All of them are fixed by this human being view or this personhood view. Why not be a personhood proponent? And then so Peter Singer presents an argument for abortion. If you grant him that personhood is the better view, he'll say, look, a person has a right to life in virtue of them preferring to continue to exist. But to violate someone's right to life is to frustrate their desire to continue to live and to exist. And he said, look, but you can only have a desire if you have a concept of yourself as a continuing subject of experience. So unless you have personhood, you can't have a desire. You can't have an understanding of yourself. So he says, no fetus has a concept of herself as a continuing subject of experience. Therefore, no fetus desires to continue to exist. Therefore, no fetus has a right to life. So basically, to sum up his argument, he basically says, if you have the property of being a person, if you have personhood, then you have a right to life. Fetuses do not have personhood. They're not self-aware. They don't know that they exist. Therefore, they don't have a right to life. Now, this is interesting, but this seems to be even worse. This seems to have even worse problems, because one of the obvious objections to this is, okay, well, what about like sleeping people or unconscious people or suicidal people who actually have desires to die? Or what about animals? They don't seem to have any desires. What makes it wrong to kill them? But even worse, Peter Singer's view implies infanticide, that basically infants don't have desires to continue to live. Infants don't have this sort of self-awareness and self-conscious. So on his view, on this personhood view, it's okay to kill infants. And now you might think that's crazy. There's no way someone holds this view, but Peter Singer basically says, yes, this is true. It's not always wrong to kill infants. And the only reason why we believe that is because we have been influenced by a Judeo-Christian society. And before the Judeo-Christian society took over the Roman Empire, tons and tons of cultures were fine with infanticide, and no one saw a problem with it. We just have been influenced by the Christian worldview, which may not have given us true beliefs about what's actually right and wrong. So that's one of the problems, or a few of the problems that you might see for personhood. Okay. Interestingly, you might think, well, as a Christian, I think that the soul enters a fetus, and when the soul enters and attaches to the fetus, that's what gives the soul personhood. That's what gives them sort of identity through time, the ability to reason later in life, and all fetuses have this soul, which grants them personhood, and that's what makes it wrong to kill a fetus. Well, what's interesting is there's some liberal theologians who would say this. They say, look, there's actually a debate about when the soul attaches to the body. When does God actually take the soul and attach it to the body? And he says, in the history of the church, there's been a debate on when this happens. There's been two views. The first view is called creationism. This says that God directly creates new human souls every time a fetus emerges in a womb. So God directly creates the human soul, and then later at some point attaches that human soul to this fetus. But then there was a second view in church history, and that was debated, and this is a view called traducianism, and this says that, look, the only soul that God directly created was Adam's soul. And Adam's soul, or at least parts of it, and Eve's, were passed on through procreation to the following generations. So God doesn't directly create everyone's human soul, but that the act of procreation generates new souls. God only indirectly created all of our souls in making Adam's soul, but procreation is what's really creating these new souls. When the sperm hits the egg, you get a fetus and simultaneously a soul combined. And so some liberal Christians, theologians will say, look, you conservative, pro-life Christians need to be a little bit more charitable to us liberal Christians. You guys are acting like view number two just is the fact of what the Bible teaches and what Christianity has always taught, that the soul comes into existence as soon as there's a fetus. But what if creationism is true? What if view one is true? And what if maybe God doesn't attach that soul to the fetus until days, weeks, months later, or maybe until conception? Who knows, right? The Muslims, they believe that abortion is allowed. It's allowable up until 120 days. Why? Because they hold a creationism view. They say it's not wrong to kill a baby or an infant a fetus before 120 days because the soul, Allah has not attached the soul yet to that fetus. So this is just something you might want to consider, and some of the arguments you might see that theologians will make regarding the abortion debate. So now we're going to move on to another personhood view. Basically, we saw Peter Singer and Michael Tooley. They argued that fetuses do not have personhood. And we saw some of the implications of that. But now we're going to look at a Christian, a Catholic Christian named Alexander Press, who argues the opposite. He says, no, I think that fetuses do have personhood. I think they are persons. And so what are some of his reasons he thinks this is true? He says, well, how about the language we use? What about the language we use when we speak of my mom was pregnant with me? If your mom wasn't pregnant with you, but just this fetus that wasn't you, then it just seems like the language you're using, we're using incorrectly. But Press says, the best way to make sense of our use of language in this way is just to say that, look, you can say that that fetus was you. Your mom was pregnant with you because that fetus just was you. And if that fetus was you, Alexander Press says that's sufficient for personhood. Because his understanding of personhood is it's what makes you you. It's the identity relationship that you have. So he says you are identical with the fetus that was in your mother's womb. And he says this just seems to follow. Like, if you really think about it, how could it not be that way? He says, look, if an organism that once existed, like a fetus, never died or never time traveled or something crazy, then that organism still exists. But if you don't hold a personhood view of the fetus, you'd have to say the fetus once existed, which was different than who I am right now, and that fetus never ceased to exist. Or it did cease to exist, but I just wasn't that fetus. And so he just seems to say that this doesn't really make sense. It just seems like it has to be the case that you were identical with that fetus and thus have personhood. Because he says, look, the fetus you once were is not a part of you because your whole body came continuously from that fetus's body. So again, he gives three quick reasons why he thinks that the human that the person that you are today had to have been identical with that fetus. And if that's the case, if the fetus wasn't a different individual or a different organism or a different entity than you are today, then that fetus has personhood. And it might have, as we'll see, it might have a right to life. So one of the things you might think of is, okay, look, if we're going to say not only is the fetus a human being, but it's also a person, you might say then, yeah, it just seems obvious to me that no matter what person it is, it would be wrong to kill an innocent person. It's wrong to kill an innocent alien. It's wrong to kill an innocent human being. Why? Because they both have personhood. And so you might put this into a thought experiment. You might say, look, suppose a demon came down and said, look, Phil, I will end all of world hunger, all famines, all wars, all disease, everything bad in this world, I'll stop it. But all you have to do is kill this 5-year-old kid. You might think to yourself, okay, well, what should you do? Should you kill the 5-year-old kid and stop all this suffering and evil and really have a great life? Like that, there's be so many benefits that you'd get if you just kill the kid. But on the flip side, you might say, no, it's just plain and simple, never morally permissible to kill a person. And even if no matter how great the goods are, it's just never morally permissible for me to kill this 5-year-old kid. And so if that's the view you hold, then you would have to say, and if you think that the fetus is a person, you have to say that no matter what, abortion is wrong. No matter how many benefits the woman would get from aborting the fetus, no matter how many financial reasons or whatever that the woman would get from aborting the fetus, it's just never okay to kill a person. A second argument you could give is if you agree that the fetus is not only a human being but a person, you might be able to use what's known as the veil of ignorance argument against abortion. This is constructed by a guy named Russell Dill Silvestro, and he basically says this: look, If we want to be as non-biased and fair as possible, let's construct a thought experiment here. He says, imagine you're behind a veil of ignorance, and on the other side of this veil is the perfect blueprints to a perfect society, or as close to perfect as possible. He says, look, you get to construct the rules. You get to decide the morals and the laws. But there's one thing. You could end up as any of those members in society. You could end up at any of them. You could end up rich, you could end up poor, you could end up black, you could end up white, you could end up a homosexual, you can end up heterosexual. Knowing that, what laws are you going to put in place to ensure that you're treated fairly no matter what lot you get in life? Well, if fetuses are persons, then you could end up as a fetus. And not only that, you could end up as a fetus getting aborted. And so you would want to put in place rules that would protect you from potentially being that fetus that would get aborted. So he says, if you grant that fetuses are persons, and if you grant that the veil of ignorance is a good way to non-biasly come up with rules to decide policy, you would have to say abortion should not be allowed. One way to object to Alexander Pruss's view is just to say, look, there are other views of personhood that don't rely on, that don't require that the fetus is a person. So yeah, that's a whole nother topic. That's a whole nother PowerPoint itself. But you could argue that there are just other views in the philosophy of mind that are just so much better than Alexander Pruss's view of persons. So so I mean, I've been going for about 50 minutes now, and we've already covered a lot, but there's still a good amount left to go. I don't know if we want to pause it and save it for another time, open up for discussion or questions, or I mean, there's a whole lot more, and really the meat of the stuff is coming up next. But I think we've been going a little too long. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, does anyone have any questions that they had written down, or any just counterpoints that they wanted to make, or encouragements or compliments? Because one of my points, Sam Mercoli, let's say something. You want to say something, Sam?
I was going to say, unless anyone has any burning questions, I would just keep going, Phil. But
Okay.
That's up to you guys. I mean, I think people want to hear the rest of what you got.
Okay.
Because
people do want to hear.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good
All
job,
right.
Jessica.
So we'll continue, but yeah, just let me know when to stop. But yeah, let's go. So here are some arguments that I think are a little bit better than all of the arguments that we've presented so far. So this is probably the number one most argued argument in the philosophical literature for why abortion is wrong. This is probably like, so what I'm saying is this is probably one of the best arguments against why abortion is wrong. And this is why. This is an argument made by a guy named Don Marquis back in the 60s. He says, look, I don't like this whole human being view stuff. I think it has implausible consequences that Michael Tooley and Peter Singer showed for us earlier, like the anencephalic, like caring for the anencephalic infant or the vegetative state person, or not accounting for why it's wrong to kill aliens. He's like, I don't like the human being view. And he's like, I also don't like the personhood view. He's like, there's too much philosophy that goes into deciding your personhood view. There's just too much deep metaphysics that's required to figure out which one's correct and which one's not. He says, I have a simpler explanation, but we're going to have to take it back a step. We're going to have to take it back a step from abortion. Let's just ask the question, why is it wrong to kill anyone ever at all? And Don Marquis says, look, this is why. Killing someone at all, killing someone to begin with, an adult, infant, a child, anything, it's wrong because it deprives that someone of all the value of their future. The future goods of their life are just no more if you kill them. What are the future goods of life? Well, I'm sure we are all familiar with those, hopefully. But he gives a few examples. He says, you know, completed projects of which we are proud are no more if you kill someone. The pursuit of goals are no more if you kill someone. Aesthetic enjoyments, look at the clouds, look at the sunset, are gone. Friendships are gone. Intellectual pursuits are gone. School, degrees, jobs, physical pleasures of all sorts are gone. These are all these future goods that you're preventing somebody from having if you kill them. So what makes it wrong to kill anyone to begin with is that you deprive them of a valuable future. And Don Marquis says, look, my view is way better than the personhood view and the human being view. Here's why. He says, look, my view explains why we think it's worse when a 10-year-old dies than when a 100-year-old dies. He says, you know, usually we're like, when the 100-year-old dies, it's obviously sad, it's obviously bad, and we're not happy about it. But when the 10-year-old dies, we're like, wow, like he had so much life to live. That was really tragic. He was only 10 years old. And Don Marquis's account of why it's wrong to kill makes sense of that. It's wrong to kill, it's worse to kill the 10-year-old because you're depriving him of even more future goods he would have experienced if he continued to live. So he says, look, my view is very explanatory, at least in this area. Number two, his view explains why being murdered is worse than being robbed or beaten. You might think, yeah, why? Why do we think, why is there worse laws for people who are murderers than for people who are robbers? And he says, look, my theory of the wrongness accounts for this. He says, if I murder somebody, or if I rob somebody, I remove some future goods from them, right? Maybe there was an object that gave them pleasure, like a phone or something, or a TV or something. It removes them from some future goods to an extent. But if I murder somebody, I'm taking away all their future value, all their future goods forever. And so this explains why murder is worse than being robbed or beaten. He says this view also would give an account for why it's wrong to kill peaceful aliens and angels. Remember, with the human being view, it was difficult to explain why. But on this view, same thing. Aliens presumably have future valuable futures, and angels presumably have futures that are valuable. So this view accounts for why it's wrong to kill them too. This view also accounts for the anencephalic newborns and the cortically dead infants and the suicidals and individuals in vegetative states that we saw was a problem for the other views. This view says, look, the anencephalic newborn will never experience future goods, ever, because it doesn't have a brain and it can't have a brain and it won't have a consciousness or anything like that. So we're not under this obligation to go all out to preserve their lives at all means. Same thing with the person who's permanently disabled in a vegetative state. Do we really have to keep them alive forever and as long as possible, and no matter what, keep them hooked up to the machine with their hearts running and their lungs pumping, even though they're never going to wake up, that their cerebrum and higher order functioning brain parts are completely and permanently damaged? He says no, because for those people, they don't have future values. They don't have a valuable future. They don't have, it's not possible for us to, if we were to kill them, we wouldn't be removing a future, a valuable future from them because they can't have it anyway. So he says, see, my view accounts for all this stuff. What else? Oh, he says his view doesn't imply speciesism, because he's saying, look, animals can have valuable futures too. He says it doesn't just apply to humans and not to some kind of other animals or species. Animals can have valuable futures too. His view doesn't imply infanticide, right? We saw the personhood view of Peter Singer. He said, you know, to have personhood is to confer upon you a right to life. Infants don't have personhood, so I guess infanticide's okay. That was Peter Singer's view. But Don Marquis' view, he says, look, my view doesn't even imply that, because infants too can have a valuable future. Lastly, his view is it's very nice because it doesn't require or rely on any religious premises, right? Like the sanctity of human life argument said, look, it's human beings are sacred, and we defended that with the Bible and with religious premises. But this doesn't at all. This is a neutral. You could be an atheist, a agnostic, a Muslim, a Jew, a Christian, and you can hold to this view because it doesn't rely on any particular religion or divine revelation. So how does this apply to abortion then? Don Marquis this is kind of his argument. He says, look, it's not morally permissible to deprive someone or something. That's key, someone or something, a future of value. Abortion deprives fetuses, something, a future of value. Therefore, abortion is not morally permissible. Notice I called the fetus something, because again, this view does not matter whether the fetus is a human being. It doesn't matter whether the fetus is a person. It doesn't matter whether the fetus is alive. It's just, can it have a valuable future? If you say yes, well, then depriving it of that would be wrong. So that's his view. This is the most cited, one of the most cited papers in this entire abortion debate in the philosophical literature. So now, let me bring up a few objections to this, though. Someone might say, well, look, Phil, this is cool and all, but it seems to have bad implications. Is this saying that, would this view lead us to say that contraception is wrong, or that abstention from sex is wrong? When you abstain from sex, you're preventing the development and creation of people with valuable futures. When you use contraception, you're preventing a sperm and egg from meeting. You're depriving what would have been an individual of a valuable future. And so it seems like your whole theory backfires if you're going to say that contraception and abstaining from sex is okay, which I'm sure most of us would say that. So that's something to think about. Does this view say no more contraception, don't ever abstain from sex, just try to create as many human beings with valuable futures as possible? So that's one concern. Another concern is this. What are we really saying here? Like, are we would this view lead to the conclusion that, like, if someone dies in Africa where the life expectancy is very low, that's not as bad as someone who dies in, like, the United States where the life expectancy is high? Like, that kind of seems, this kind of seems to be inequality here. If we go with this view, we're saying it's worse, the death of someone is worse if they have more time for a valuable future, and infants in sub-Saharan Africa have a less life expectancy than infants in the US. So it's less wrong to kill infants in the US or in Africa. That just seems like a little weird implication of this view. But again, I'm not saying these are good or bad objections. I leave it to you to decide. And also, that's not even there's responses to these objections in the literature, and responses to the responses, and rebuttals, and you can go crazy reading all the different avenues people have gone in defending this argument or objecting to it. So, okay, moving on. Another way to object to this type of argument from Don Marquis, this future like ours, is to construct a better theory, a theory that's more explanatory, that doesn't have the problems that Don Marquis' theory had. And that's what this guy, David Boonin, he tries to do. He says, look, I like futures like ours. He says, I'll give you that, Don Marquis, but that's not enough. It has to be a future. It has to be an individual with something called an ideal dispositional desire. So an individual has to have a ideal dispositional desire to have a future like ours. So what does that mean? I'll explain. David Boonin says, look, what makes it wrong to murder is not just the deprivation of a valuable future, like Don Marquis says, but it's the deprivation of a future that one has an interest in. So if this individual we're talking about doesn't have an interest in their valuable future, it's not wrong to kill them. And he says this theory is better. This theory is more explanatory. Why? It doesn't have the problems that Don Marquis' view does. It doesn't make contraception wrong, and it doesn't make it worse to kill an infant in sub-Saharan, or less worse to kill an infant in sub-Saharan Africa than it does in the United States. So he says, see, my view is a little bit better. But now you might think to yourself, but okay, doesn't this run into the same problem that Peter Singer's view had? Peter Singer said you need to have personhood, you need to have self-awareness, and you need to have desires. How is this not different? Peter Singer says, to violate someone's right to life is to frustrate her desire to continue to live. But remember, we saw the implications of that. That led to us saying that infants don't have rights to live and that infanticide is okay. So does David Bunin run to the same problem? Well, he says, no, this is where the ideal dispositional desires comes into play. He says there's something called occurrent desires, which are desires you're having right now, that you're thinking of right now. I'm desiring to finish this, reading this sentence. And dispositional desires, which are desires that you are not currently thinking about. Like, for example, just a few seconds ago, I wasn't thinking, I desire to continue to live a good life. But I do have that desire, even though if I'm not thinking about it right now. So those are dispositional desires. And he says, so look, newborns, toddlers, people who are in vegetative states, they have a right to life, even if they don't currently have the desires like Peter Singer said you need to have. He says, why? Because they have ideal dispositional desires. These are desires that they would have were they able to have desires. These are desires that in an ideal situation they would have. So if they were in an ideal situation, these infants, these temporary comatose people, they would have the desire for a valuable future. And so they thus have a right to life for that reason. One objection to this is that, look, this still seems to fail because what about the case of a suicidal teenager? Their dispositional desires might not be to live. But David Bunin says, oh, but it's got to be an ideal dispositional desire. If they weren't handicapped by depression and mental illness, their ideal dispositional desire would be to have a valuable future. But if that's the case, then why can't you say the same thing about the fetus? If the fetus weren't handicapped by development, it would have this desire to live a valuable future. So that's one of the objections to this argument. Again, I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'll leave you to decide. Okay, now I've just presented to you Don Marquis' argument, which is the #1 argument against abortion. Let me give you now the #1 argument for abortion. This is called the violinist argument for abortion by Judith Jarvis Thompson. She wrote this paper, A Defense of Abortion, in 1971. And you're going to see I'm going to present 3 sort of thought experiments. And after we go through the thought experiments, she's going to try to say, look, because of these thought experiments, we think abortion is morally acceptable. So here is the first scenario. The first scenario says, look, imagine you wake up in the morning and you find yourself back to back in bed with an unconscious violinist, a famous unconscious violinist. He's been found to have a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers had canvassed all the available medical records and found that you alone have the right blood type to help this violinist. So they have kidnapped you and last night, and they hooked up the violinist circulatory system so that your kidneys can be used to extract the poisons from his blood as well as your own. And you're kind of like, okay, this is kind of crazy. Why? How can you just kidnap me and hook me up and use my kidneys to keep this violinist alive? But, don't worry. The director of the hospital comes in and says, look, we're sorry the Society of Music Lovers came in and did this to you. We never would have permitted it if we had known. But still, they did it, and the violinist is now plugged into you. And if you unplug from him, he's going to die. But never mind that. It's only for 9 months. By then, he will have recovered from his ailment and can safely be unplugged from you. So I think what Judith Thompson is trying to point out in this case, she says, look, that just seems absurd. If we found ourselves in that situation, it would be a nice thing for us to stay and for 9 months and leave our kidneys attached to this unconscious violinist so he can survive. But there's no way that's a requirement. There's no way that that's like a moral duty upon us to do that. That seems going above and beyond our call of moral duties. Right. Now you might think, well, okay, Phil, I see where you're going with this. You're going to say, okay, well, if it's not wrong to unplug from the violinist who needs you for 9 months, can't the woman then can unplug the fetus from her womb, but via an abortion, so she doesn't have to carry it for 9 months. You might say, but Phil, that's too fast. This analogy isn't analogous to abortion. This analogy is more akin to like someone being raped, right? Because this woman or this person was kidnapped and they didn't consent to having their kidneys being plugged in. So this is really just a good argument to show that in cases of rape, the woman might be able to have an abortion because she didn't consent to it. And our intuition in the violinist case is that, yeah, it's okay to unplug from the violinist. At least that's most people's intuition. Maybe you differ. Maybe you don't have the intuition. But Judith Jarvis Thompson says, okay, fine, I grant you that, but notice what you're conceding. If you say yes, if you say you are allowed to unplug from the violinist in this case, what you're saying is the right to life can be superseded. The right to life of this violinist can be superseded by other considerations. And she says, if you grant her that, you've already granted me a lot. And by the way, I forgot to mention a very key point. She even says, look, I'm going to grant you for the sake of argument that the fetus is a human being and a person with a right to life. I'm going to grant you all three of those things. It's a person, human being person with a right to life. But she says, but if you say yes, that you can unplug yourself from this violinist who also has a right to life and is a human being and a person, then what you're saying is sometimes it's okay to violate someone's right to life in certain circumstances. And she says, I have another analogy that proves more than just that it's okay to have abortions when than in rape cases. She says, imagine, you're in a room, it's stuffy, you open a window and you walk away for a little bit and a burglar climbs in. It would be like kind of ridiculous to say to her, well, oh yeah, the burglar can do that now because you knew the risk you were running when you opened that window. You basically gave him that right when you opened that window. You had full knowledge that burglars that they go in through windows. You should have been more careful. Now you have to deal with this burglar. You can't kick him out. You can't call 911. So she's trying to say that I lost my train of thought. Let me just go back. Okay, I'll just finish reading the quote. She says, it would still be more absurd to say this if you had bars installed outside of your windows precisely to prevent burglars from getting in, and the burglar got in only because of a defect in the bar. So she's saying, look, even if you went to the length of opening the window but installing these bars, if a burglar got in because one of the bars was loose or something and he could slide right in, this still wouldn't be okay for the burglar to use your property like that, to go into your house unwarranted. And she says, well, this is kind of similar to women, right? Women, how about women who use contraceptives, who use birth control, who use condoms, who practice the safe sex practices, but yet, so they're really trying their best. They know the risk. They know the risk is that they could get pregnant, but they're really trying their best not to get pregnant. But sometimes there's mistakes happen. Sometimes the condom breaks, or sometimes the birth control is not working, and women can get pregnant because of that. And so Judith Jarvis Thompson is kind of saying, look, this is analogous. Like the infant is almost like an invader. It's something that wasn't consented to. It's something that we shouldn't allow in through the window. And then there's a last analogy that was actually an actual judiciary case in 1978. There was this man named Robert McFall. He was diagnosed with a disease that required him to secure bone marrow transplant quickly. Many people were tested to see if their bone marrow were compatible with McFall's, but only one test came back promising, and that was his cousin's, David Shimp. Before a test could confirm the compatibility of Shimp's bone marrow with McFall's was able to be conducted, Shimp changed his mind. He was no longer willing to give McFall his bone marrow. So McFall sued Shimp in an attempt to get the state to coerce Shimp into giving him, McFall, his bone marrow. The judge, however, dismissed this case. Shimp was not coerced into giving McFall his bone marrow, and 15 days later, McFall died. So what's the moral of this story? The moral of the story that David Boonin and Judith Jarvis Thompson are trying to get at is, in this case, although it would have been a really nice thing if David Shimp went ahead and gave his bone marrow to McFall, it's not something that can be demanded of him. And it's not something that he would be morally wrong for doing if he didn't do it. That just seems like too much, and the state, there's no way that the state could make somebody just don't like force you to donate your bone marrow just because someone's going to die if you don't. And so this is where the argument now, the main argument is put into place. It goes like this. Being a person does not give one the right to use another's body, even if it's needed for survival. So again, we're granting that the fetus is a person here. We're granting that the fetus is a human being and that it has a right to life. But given these violinist, burglar, and bone marrow analogies, it seems like there are cases where our intuitions show that being a person does not give one the right to use another person's body, even if that body is needed for survival. Premise 2, therefore, even if the fetus is a person, it does not have the right to use its mother's body, even if it is needed for survival. So to summarize this, after all these analogies, the proponents of abortion want to say this: the right to life does not include or entail the right to be provided with the use or the continued use of whatever is needed in order to go on living. And basically, they want to put abortion in terms of not providing assistance. It's not directly killing the infant, it's just not providing them your body. So no one could be expected for me to let me use their body. So I'm not killing the infant, I'm just not giving them the assistance. I'm not giving them my body. So there are a few objections. Again, I'm not saying any of these are good or bad. But one of the objections is to this type of argument is to say, well, there may be other properties that grant the fetus the right to the mother's body. For example, mothers have been arrested in the past for not breastfeeding their infants. So it seems that infants have a right in certain circumstances to their mother's breast or breast milk, should I say. And so it seems like there could be other properties that would give a fetus the right to the mother's body. A second objection might be, well, these cases, Phil, that you gave, these analogies, they're not analogous enough to abortion cases. You aren't letting die. You aren't just letting the fetus die in abortion. You're actively going in there with suction and with knives and with instruments, and you're killing. You are actively killing. It's not just, oh, I'm not providing assistance. You are actively doing something. So these cases aren't analogous enough. And then the third objection might just be this. Look, sure, in most cases, we can't expect others to give us their bodies so that they can live. But mothers have a special obligation and responsibility to their children. So they do have a responsibility to their children to give them their bodies. So these are three possible objections you might give to this argument. Okay, we're almost finished. I think I just have 2 or 3 more slides, hopefully. So moving on from that, this is another argument against abortion. It's very clever, in my opinion. It's a brand new argument, and by brand new I mean it was published in 2018. It goes like this: causing an organism O to have fetal alcohol syndrome is immoral. So what's fetal alcohol syndrome? It's basically when a mother's pregnant, she drinks too much alcohol, and then the baby comes out and it has all sorts of long-term disabilities and problems and suffering throughout the rest of its life. So seems like premise 1 here is, it just seems obvious, right? If you cause your fetus to have fetal alcohol syndrome, then that's immoral. If you knowingly do that, there's a problem. But Perry Hendricks, he says, okay, well, if you grant me that, then grant me this too. If causing O to have fetal alcohol syndrome is immoral, well, then killing O is immoral. He says, what's the justification for that? He says, look, if I harm someone by cutting off their left leg, it'd be more harmful to cut off both of their legs, right? So in the same way as if you say it's harming a fetus, it's immoral to give a fetus fetal alcohol syndrome, well, you should also say then that it's immoral to kill, because that's something worse than giving the fetus fetal alcohol syndrome. Killing it is even worse. So he says, therefore, killing O is immoral. If one aborts O, then she kills O. Therefore, to abort O is immoral. Very clever argument. It all depends on whether or not you think it actually is immoral to give an organism fetal alcohol syndrome. Maybe you don't. And that's kind of one of the objections. One of the objections would be to premise 1. It would say, well, what if a woman intends to have an abortion immediately? What if she gives this fetus fetal alcohol syndrome, but then has the abortion and the fetus never develops any of these harmful symptoms because, they're dead? That might be a way to object to premise one. Here's another interesting argument, the argument from heaven for abortion. It goes like this: if Christianity is true, then aborted fetuses go to heaven. Christianity is true, therefore aborted fetuses go to heaven. If a person aborts a fetus, then she guarantees that the fetus goes to heaven. If someone guarantees that a fetus goes to heaven, then she acts permissibly. Hence, if a person aborts a fetus, then she acts permissibly. That is, abortion is always permissible. If abortion is always permissible, then the pro-life position is false. Hence, the pro-life position is false. So basically, I think you see the argument. Most Christians would say, look, if a fetus dies, God isn't evil, he's just, he's moral. He's going to send that infant to heaven. He's not going to send it to hell. But if that's the case, then like abortion seemed like a sure way to get people into heaven. And if that's like the goal of life and that's what matters the most, then why are you Christians against abortions? I guess there's a few objections, but I give one objection. Someone might think, well, sure, the purpose of life is to go to heaven and get people into heaven, but you don't know, by aborting that fetus, you might have been aborting the next Billy Graham. You might have been aborting the next Mother Teresa, who brought tons of people to heaven. So this actually isn't ensuring that the most people go to heaven. So that might be one way to object to this. And then the another here's I think this is the second. Yeah, this is the second last argument. It's called the argument from uncertainty. It says, look, Phil, I've listened to your whole PowerPoint. I'm just confused. You just confused me. You gave me tons of arguments for and against. I don't know what to believe. I don't know what's true. So then you might like this argument. This argument says, look, if your kid comes up to you and says, Daddy, can I kill it? You might stop for a second and say, well, wait, what are you talking about? Kill the fly, kill the cricket, kill the neighbor's next door neighbor's dog, kill your sister. You might want to really clarify, like, well, what do you mean? Before I answer you, let me get this straight. What is it that you're talking about? Can I kill it? Another example you might think is this. Suppose a man is going to be awarded $1 million for blowing up a building. A woman asks the man if there's anyone inside the building. The man responds, well, there's probably a 2% chance anyone is in the building, so I should be fine. You might say, like, no, dude, even if there's a 2% chance, you better be absolutely sure there's no one in that building. You better be absolutely sure you're not killing anyone. And so the moral of this argument and these thought experiments is just to say this: err on the side of life, err on the side of caution. If you don't know whether the fetus has a right to life, why then would you risk it? Why would you risk it, have an abortion, or be pro-choice when you very well could be killing someone with a right to life? On the flip side, if you're pro-life, it's not a big risk. The risk is a lot less than someone's life, someone's potential life. So all this argument says is, if you had to choose between the pro-life and pro-choice position and you're confused and you don't know the status and right to life of an embryo, you should go with the pro-life side, because it very well could be something with a right to life, and you just admitted that you don't know. So in the same case that this guy said, well, I don't know if there's anyone in the building, but there's probably only a 2% chance that there is. Well, that wasn't acceptable. He needs to be very sure before he presses the button to blow up that building. And the last argument is kind of an argument you see online. It's called the pro-life trolley problem. This is a very famous, the trolley problem is a very famous thought experiment. It says, look, so there's a trolley and you have a lever to change the tracks. If the trolley goes straight, it'll kill one baby, but you can move the lever and cause the trolley to veer off course and kill 100 embryos. So what do you do? Do you make it veer off course and save the baby, or do you let it keep going straight and save the 100 embryos? I think what this argument is trying to do is it's trying to bring out the intuition that we should probably save the baby. Most people would probably say, oh, I'd save the baby. And some people will try to say, okay, well then, you see that shows that we really don't ascribe embryos this right to life that you pro-life people think we do. One objection to this is that this whole analogy isn't even analogous to abortion, because this doesn't even show that embryos don't have a right to life, right? You could put two people who we agree have a right to life and ask the same question, but just because you put one choice over the other doesn't mean you showed one didn't have a right to life. And number two, this is asking us who to save, not who should we kill, essentially. But in abortion, we're asking who to kill. So yeah, that's it. That's my abortion PowerPoint. It was very long. We're going for an hour and 20 minutes now. I'm sorry, but I hope you guys thought that was interesting. And I'm willing to have a good discussion maybe next time or tonight if we have more time.
Okay. So I know it's late and the PowerPoint was long. So please come and go as you wish. But if there's anyone who, I'll just kind of open up this time, maybe like 10 or 15 minutes to anyone who wants to ask questions to Phil directly about the presentation or anything he said. It was a lot of information, so I'm sure he I'm sure he wants to clarify more about stuff. So I'm sure he would like any questions. So yeah, so I'll just unmute your mic if you have any questions, I guess. There's only 14 people here. Or yeah, you could raise your hand too. That might work. I see Omar, you have a question, so you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was just, I guess, curious if there's a second part that might, I don't know, like make a commentary on the pragmatic side of the argument, because I know we dived really deep into the moral aspect, but maybe not so much touched upon like pragmatically, like what are the stats looking like, what are the policies doing,
Yeah.
how are the rates of abortion going since we started recording, things like that.
Yeah, no, you're right. There was so much we actually didn't discuss. So much more, as you said, about the statistics, about the politics, about the, like you said, the practical aspect. Like, can we have all these more lives and beings? Like, who's going to take care of all these people if we just ban abortion? Or can we really put all these burdens on women? And what about the financial aspect? Yeah, there's so much stuff we could have talked about, but I kind of just wanted to limit this PowerPoint to, as you said, the moral aspect. But yeah, man, there's so much that still needs to be considered. But yeah, these are just really the philosophical arguments.
All right, anyone else?
Tyson.
Okay, so Tyson and then Celine.
Yeah, no, you can go first.
Okay, Celine, ask your question.
Okay. Hi.
Hey.
Thank you. Hey. So I just wanted to ask, as a medical student and as someone who's been to courses such as medical ethics and stuff like that,
Yeah.
and the books that we discussed in the PowerPoints, is the curriculum universal, or does it kind of depend based on the religious or political views of the professors? I was just wondering, like, do the courses change depending on who you get? Yeah.
No, that's a good question. So as far as like the scientific stuff, the scientific considerations, that can't possibly change. That's just, those are the facts. And those all embryology books are going to present those facts. But with the philosophical arguments, oh, absolutely. I've had many philosophy professors and ethics professors who, they're biased, but to be fair, we're all biased. I'm biased. It's tough to present a non-biased presentation and to really show all of the arguments and really try to give all the objections. But no, I've had professors who didn't want to present any of the arguments for against abortion, and who, or I'm really into philosophy of religion, like Sam, with like arguments for and against the existence of God. I've had philosophy professors who, they didn't even know there were arguments for the existence of God. They only presented the philosophical arguments against God. And it was just kind of like, dude, like, give us a broader range here to help us think for ourselves, So yeah, there's bias, but I mean, I'm biased. We're all biased. We just got to try to recognize it and not let it show as much. But yeah, good question.
Thank you.
Tyson?
Yeah. Yeah, Phil. So first off, if I say auto hetan taleo, you know what that means?
Aton, say again.
Auto hetan taleo.
I don't know. I don't.
What about kale dulea?
Yeah, Kalidilia. Yeah, good work.
Okay, sweet. Follow-up question. I thought the Don Marquise one was pretty interesting. So
Yeah.
how would he or anyone reconcile like killing a violent thing? Because I think you talked about not killing something that was peaceful, like an alien or like a person.
Yeah.
Like, would he think killing something that was violent or something that could cause us harm, would that be like morally acceptable, or would that still be unacceptable from a moral standpoint?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. And to be honest, I'm not sure what Don Marquise would say to that. It's interesting because he is okay, and his position allows for things like active euthanasia. But as far as like capital punishment, like killing someone who maybe is a threat to society, yeah, I would have to think about that. I'm not sure. That's a really good question. That's a really good question. Would his view allow for that, or would it say, nope, even the violent person is has a valuable future that you shouldn't remove? And maybe that's a problem for the view, or maybe it's not a problem. Maybe you don't think it's a problem for the view. But that's a good question. I don't know what to say to that.
Sweet.
Go on. Oh, sorry, Tyson.
No, go ahead, Rich.
I was saying, going off of the same type of argument, like you mentioned active euthanasia, one of the arguments is when you mentioned earlier that you're depriving future good from a thing when you remove its life. In the euthanasia argument, they're saying, like the comatose person and like the infant that doesn't have a consciousness, they don't have any good left. So like they're either terminally ill or one of these things, and they're just going to suffer until they die painfully. Could you say, or I don't know what the best argument for or against this mindset would be, but if a child is going to be born into a very low income, very poor circumstance where the families are all addicted to drugs and they already have 8 kids, and it's going to take away resources from the other children to use it on this one, and inevitably the kid's going to just have a horrible upbringing in a sense.
Yeah.
Is that any in line with any of these, or more in line or with any of these arguments? I was just trying to figure out a counter to some.
Yeah, no, that's good, and that's an objection that Don Marquise brings up in his paper, because he's gonna say, like I said, he's for active euthanasia. So if someone comes to a doctor, he thinks, and they say, look, my life is horrible, and it actually is, like, not just, it can't just be that they feel their life is horrible when
Yeah, my brother
actually,
broke up with me and I'm really sad about it.
right, no, like objectively, like if we had a God's eye point of view, would this person's future actually be miserable, or would it actually be okay? If we say from a God's eye point of view it's miserable, Don Marquise thinks, yeah, it's okay for that person to elect to undergo to actively euthanize this guy. But if he says, if from a God's eye point of view it's not, his life is actually okay and actually decent, then it would be wrong to euthanize him, because we'd be depriving him of a future like ours. Now with regards to like people in vegetative states, they basically just don't have a future. Like, that's kind of his argument. He's like, they just don't have really a good or bad future. Like, they just won't ever have any sort of conscious experiences. They'll never be able to speak or see anything again. They're just being kept alive by machines. So there's absolutely no problem with pulling the plug in cases of those people. But with newborns and infants, he says, newborns, infants, fetuses, they have the potential to have a future like ours. They have good future, they're future goods that they would be missing out if we were to kill them. So in a sense, his argument is kind of a potentiality argument too, because it doesn't really matter that you have a good future now, but that you have the capacity, the potentiality to have one.
Yeah. One of the doctors that I work for was telling her about a friend that had an abortion, and I was upset about it. And one of her ways to comfort me was to share the fact that a lot of children end up being abused anyways.
Yeah.
So it was that argument where it's like there's going to be a potential heinous act that's enacted towards them, so might as well keep them from that.
Right.
But then, you know, that gets into like soul building, and are these acts that are
Yeah.
horrible actually meant for good in some sense? So.
Right, from a God's eye point of view, what really is this person's future? Is it valuable or not? And yeah, I guess here's where my bias kind of shows through. How I would answer that, I would just kind of say, like, you know, okay, yes, people have bad lives sometimes, or they go through bad things, but like, so what's the solution? Kill them?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that just kind of seems extreme, but yeah, that's just kind of my opinion.
Yeah.
Going from that, like,
well, so Omar raised his hand, so since he was more polite, let's let him go first.
sorry.
Wow.
I didn't mean to start this hand raising thing. You can definitely talk over me if you want, but I guess a critique I have to a lot of the arguments being made, or the entire stance of being strictly pro-life. Personally, I just want to preface by saying I don't know where I stand. I think it's too hard to make a clear-cut decision. But I think a lot of the arguments are too personal. They not just focused on just anecdote, but they're a little bit too concerned about, like, they're compartmentalized. They're focused on that person in that situation. And we can forget that, like, abortion is an emergent property that society has, whether you consider it a problem or not. It's what happens when a group of human beings get together, they interact, and social phenomena arise. But I don't think we address solutions in that sense. So we talk about, like, I personally think that abortion is heinous because it's a murder of a person, but we don't discuss the effects on legalizing it or not on a group of human beings. Empirically speaking, for example, data has shown that the rates of abortion have decreased since recorded history started. And classical literature has shown that abortion is an age-old thing. Like, it's existed as far as human beings have existed. And you can argue that modern day policies have caused a decrease in the rates of abortion. At least that's what we empirically see. So then you can make, like, a collective decision, maybe, or an opinion, and say maybe legalizing abortion on the grand scheme of things actually reduces abortions. All this to say that we don't really talk about it in as emergent property in society as a whole. And I feel like a lot of the pro-life arguments are very focused on an individual or anecdotes, or anyways, I digress.
Yeah. I think one thing I'll say to that is, like, that's just the nature of philosophical and moral applied ethics arguments in general. You know, I guess one thing that I would ask you to think about is, suppose allowing abortions, making that legal, has the implication in society that, like, yeah, there's way less abortions and way less people are dying or something. So wouldn't that pro-life person want then to legalize abortions to prevent more abortions or something like that from happening? One way to think about that is this. Look, like, what if we said the same thing about, like, rape? What if we said, well, if we allow rape, we're just going to have more, we're going to have less rapes if we allow it. So we should allow it. You know, or you could do that with any example. And the moral philosopher isn't so concerned with the consequences of the pragmatic, practical aspects of it, but they're trying to determine what's actually wrong, what's immoral. And that kind of gets into a lot of questions. Are there morals? Do you think we're held to a standard outside ourselves. Is it all just a societal construct? And that's going to determine how you think about these arguments. But I think let me say one last thing. These arguments, I think you're right. I think most people don't like look at these arguments and like, oh yeah, that's why I'm pro-life. That's why I'm pro-choice. But we're supposed to use them as tools. We're supposed to say, look, if we're saying logic and reason is an objective world that helps us remove our biases, let's look at both arguments on both sides as objectively as possible. Let's do this as objectively as possible. And if we're honest with ourselves, which side has the better arguments? Which side had the better case? And I think that's a way to have a well-informed, rational, reasonable opinion, as opposed to just being dogmatic about something, or just believing something because your parents believe it, or just believing something because your religion tells you it, or just, you know what I mean? Like, it's a way to remove your bias. And that's the value of these types of discussions or debates or arguments.
Fair enough.
So I don't know who the iPhone person is, but I see you have your hand raised. So let's go with you, then Celine, and then Tyson.
I don't know if that's me. I mean, I raised my hand.
Yeah, it is you. It is you.
Okay, fantastic. I'm not that philosophically minded, I will say. But I kind of wanted to just say something from like the last girl that spoke. I don't know your name, I'm sorry. But yeah, you had mentioned what if the child will be abused? I just wanted, again, I'm not a philosopher here, but I just wanted to just say like my 2 cents.
Yeah.
Okay, so even if the fetus is, even if the child grows, right, and will be abused, why still destroy that potential life, right? I mean, evil is going to be, it's going to be everywhere. It's inevitable, right? Someone who's 14 years old might still end up getting raped. Someone who's 37 years old is going to end up getting raped, right? So what, you're going to just kill the fetus just because, oh, but it might end up getting raped? I mean, obviously, there are circumstances where the mother is concerned that, hey, I'm not economically stable and my boyfriend is a drug addict and I don't have a supportive family. So since I'm not going to be economically responsible for this child, I just have to destroy it and get rid of it. I mean, obviously the child could be set up for adoption, but like still, even though that child wouldn't be exposed to like a healthy family, later down the road, that child still has the ability to make his or her own decisions, right? Hey, I got out of a toxic family that was always getting drunk, that was always out doing drugs, but I'm going to like do something different. I'm going to like break that curse. I'm going to go to college. I'm going to take my own decision to better myself and not follow this chain of doing drugs. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense, right? But
yeah, no, you got it. Good job.
Yeah, so I think stuff like that is what, you know, people should also consider. And lastly, I just want to say there's purpose and so much value in everyone. Even if you're just like a fetus, eventually that will be a human. It's a human life. I mean, the moment of conception, that's where life basically happens. I mean, there's so much value and purpose, and once that child is able to recognize the world around them, they're going to say that they're going to start recognizing good things and bad things, right? That child has the ability later down the road to like explore, and then if they find that purpose, whether it's good, whether it's bad, I mean, they'll have that option, and they get to choose if they want to make good or bad decisions. So that's all I'm gonna say.
Preach, girl. I don't actually believe all the thing that I mentioned. I was just trying to start an argument, which I guess I did poorly, which was meant to actually be an argument, but just to start conversation. Oh, and she left.
Oh.
Celine.
First, I wanted to thank again for all of the views. It's been a very enlightening and eye-opening conversation. I think something that I've been struggling to grasp, and like Omar said, for me, this is also a very like push and pull kind of situation where there's so many good arguments on both sides. But something that personally concerns me is illegal abortions and people taking that into their own hands and doing it in a way that's very unsafe to the women, because it will happen no matter what. There's no way that that can't change. I was just wondering, how does pro-choice necessarily always mean pro-death and pro-murder, or pro-choice as in you have the liberty to make that decision for yourself, where if it's a universal kind of decision that is governed by pro-life over everyone, is that kind of forcing the Christian view on everyone's liberty to decide? Or I don't know. I'm trying to construct an eloquent way to say this, but struggling a little bit.
Yeah. I guess you said a few things. I'll try to address them. Right. So you mentioned sort of the illegal abortions, and it's kind of like if you make abortion illegal, you got to admit that there's going to be people trying to get abortions in unsafe ways, or trying to do it to themselves, or what have you. And like Omar was saying, that could making laws just universal like that could have implications like that, where people are now trying to harm themselves in that same way. But I think what someone in response to you would say, like you could say that about anything. What about like heroin? People are going to do heroin illegally anyway. So why not just make it legal and government funded, and we can make taxes off of it, and then people can get it safely so they know the amount they're getting so they don't overdose. It's kind of like you're going to have to draw a line. You're going to have to figure out certain principles that's going to guide where you stop that process. And then number two, you said, would that be like forcing the Christian worldview? And it could be if we said, listen, all abortions are illegal tomorrow. It would depend what reasons you gave. So like I said, Don Marquise's arguments on the future deprivation account, his view doesn't rely on religion at all. His view doesn't say we have a soul. It doesn't say that God exists. It doesn't say that the Bible's true or anything like that. His view is abortion is wrong based upon religiously neutral reasons. But so in the same way, really, it depends, right? It depends. It's because somebody could say, look, I'm a Christian. I believe abortion is wrong just because the Bible says so or something, and that's why we're going to make abortion illegal. Then you'd be forcing Christianity upon everybody. But if Don Marquise's argument is actually good, if his argument is actually really good and doesn't rely on religion, then if it's a sound argument, then people should be pro-life apart from any sort of religion. Like there are many atheists who are persuaded by Don Marquise's argument that hold this position. My professor was one of them. He was a Jew who became an atheist, but but he thinks Don Marquise's argument is actually sound, and so he thinks abortion in most cases is wrong. So yeah, I think tonight there was only one argument that was presented that had religious premises, and it was the sanctity of human life argument. And like I said, that's probably not a good argument, like to argue against people who don't believe that, right? That might be good as an in-house debate argument with other Christians. Maybe some Christians agree, some people don't. But as far as the agnostic or the atheist or someone else, that's just not a good argument, and it's not going to persuade anybody, So yeah, I hope I answered your question or gave thoughts to think about. But
maybe I could say a thing on that, because I was thinking, like, Celine, when you were talking as well as like Omar, you guys were sort of talking about the political and pragmatic implications that some of these things might have. And I think here it's just really important, especially with what you said, Celine, to think about why we're talking about the philosophical and moral implications first, because let's say you say that abortion is wrong, it's immoral, you're killing not just a human person, but not just a human being, but a person, and then you say, well, for other reasons, I think it should be. I don't think it should be illegal. I think it should be legal. What these moral considerations and what logic helps us see is that what you just basically said is that the killing of an innocent person should be legal, and that we should just have people because basically, like that's why the moral part matters. Like that first statement I said, if you think it's wrong, but then you think it should be legal, what you're saying is that the killing of an innocent person should be legal, and that seems like something that we don't want. It seems like something that I feel like most people would be like, yeah, killing an innocent person, that should be illegal. That shouldn't be legal. If the law is doing anything, that seems like one of the most clear things to me, right? But see, that's the thing, right? That's what considering the moral stuff helps us with, because then you see, well, okay, actually, this first step, considering whether or not I think abortion is immoral, actually has implications down the line to the pragmatic and political implications. And I think like that's why we were talking about that for the most part, is because from these sort of moral and philosophical standpoints outflows everything else. And a lot of people in the public nowadays don't normally consider that, and that's why you see a lot of bad arguments. So yeah, hopefully that clarifies a little bit like of my thoughts of what you said.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I remember I said I was going to let Tyson ask a question, so maybe I'll let him, and then Omar, you got a question, I'll let you go after that.
Yeah. No, I was just gonna talk about, I guess, what Rachel said like a while ago about, because I was kind of having the same questions when we were presented with the Don Marquis argument about the what's they called, like the future something.
Future deprivation account or future like ours.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
But I think those questions were answered in the next one with the ideal reality, like that theory. I think like if, because I don't think it was the same as like from the God's eye view. It was like if everyone had like an ideal situation, like that's like the type of, like they wouldn't want to be dead. Yeah, I think a lot of what Rich was saying was some stuff like stuff I was thinking about too, because like a lot of the stuff I do like in Philadelphia, it's kind of hard. Like there's a lot of like the abortion rates in Philadelphia are pretty high because like people legitimately like can't afford to have like children. Because I mean, raising a child is obviously very expensive. Philadelphia is loaded with a bunch of impoverished people. Not saying abortion is right, but I'm saying I understand why, like the abortion rate is high, because it's tough. I think I wrote down like just a question to myself, like, is killing the baby like better or worse than having a baby who's just like addicted to drugs? Like what? Like, because I don't know, because I think the argument that like a dead baby is worse than a drug addicted baby. But like when I hear that, I'm just like I don't know.
Yes, right. So yeah, that came up a few times, right? Like what about these people who are just going to live awful lives or be drug addicts or something? Wouldn't it just be better if they're dead? And I think one thing I'll say to that is just like, but what, like if you say yes, then what are you really saying to the people now who have bad lives and are drug addicts?
Right.
So that might just be something to think about too. It's like, yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean you're kind of in a bind there, because I know like even if we read the Bible or something, like if we read Job, he even says like, I wish I was never born, when he had like all like obviously he had a pretty difficult life.
Yeah.
For a little bit, just a little hard. But yeah, I think it's tough, and I think even something I realized, or something I thought about from a, I guess, theological standpoint, when we were talking about if Christianity is true, like that whole thing, and like if you abort a baby, like they
Yeah.
go to heaven. But like I don't. Well, from a Protestant and Catholic standpoint, wouldn't that not be true? Because they believe in original sin, which is like basically original guilt, which means a baby is actually guilty of sin
Yes.
before they even do anything. So
Yeah.
talking, if they're killing the baby, that baby's not going to go to heaven. If they're holding fast to like a Protestant theological belief or a Catholic like theological belief, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah.
Listen,
No.
I will stand up for my fellow Protestants that I believe that a lot would say that there's an age of understanding that needs to be reached before the consequences of original sin.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are many different Protestant views, right? So you might be a hardcore Calvinist and believe in the doctrine of inherited guilt, that not only do we have the original sin from Adam and Eve, but we inherited their guilt. And so those people might say, yeah, if an infant wasn't infant baptized, they didn't have that original guilt removed, and they weren't forgiven for that sin, and that infant will go to hell. But like Dan was saying, there are many Protestant denominations that would say, well, there's an age of accountability, or there's a it's more obvious to us that God is perfectly just and that he wouldn't do something like that. So I think there's a ton of different views. You know, it's interesting, Tyson. There's an Orthodox view that I'm not saying is the view or is a dogmatic view that you have to hold if you're Orthodox, but the Orthodox would say an unbaptized infant doesn't go to heaven, but they don't go to hell either. They go to this like middle state. It's not purgatory, but it's like this middle state that's between heaven and hell. It's not torturous, but it's not like, woo, the greatest thing ever. And so some people believe that. Some Orthodox priests believe that. So that might be a way out of the argument.
I guess since we're talking about the theological argument about heaven, maybe you could. I would be interested to hear your thoughts on. Okay, well, maybe instead of just having to say whether the fetus is going to heaven or going to hell, well, God knows either way because He knows the counterfactual. He knows, if they did live a life, would they have accepted His grace? Would they have repented? Would they have had faith? And that's the decision He's making it on. What do you think about that?
Yeah, like just to repeat what Sam said, Sam is saying maybe it's the case that God will judge this infant on what they would have done if they were able to survive and live this life. And so some might have been good, some might have been bad, and God knows that in advance, and so He will make His decision accordingly. I think William Lane Craig addressed that once before. He said something like, and I think I agree with him. He's like, that's just not right. Like, you can only be guilty for something you do, not something you would have done. Like, you can only be guilty for things you actually do, and that's kind of why, like, the whole inherited guilt doctrine of certain Protestant groups, I don't think works either, because it just doesn't seem like I can be guilty for someone else's faults in the way that inherited guilt suggests, or in the way Sam is suggesting these counterfactuals would make someone guilty. So
yeah, Omar.
I'm just throwing random counter arguments. But what if it's greater than the kid living or not? What if the choice being made for the kid's lives, or the ability rather to have that choice, what if that saves other lives? I guess what I'm trying to say is, like going to the earlier argument, to me, pragmatism, like practical evidence, and specifically the scientific process, helps determine my morals. I don't see them as one or the other. If I see evidence in front of me that tells me, hey, chances are that this is going to lead to good things, I'm inclined to support it, especially if it follows a scientifically rigorous process, if it's peer reviewed, if science backs it. So what if the ability for that kid who is going to grow or be like Jeff Bezos or be a druggie, I don't know what he was going to do. Frankly, I don't care too much. What if the ability to choose actually impacts more than just his life?
To choose what?
The ability to be able, I guess, to get an abortion.
Oh, I see. So what? Yeah. So this is kind of this is what moral philosophers call utilitarianism. So they say you should always act in accordance, so let's say you have two choices, A and B, and you're like, I don't know which one to do. A utilitarian would say you should always take the choice that's going to result in the greatest amount of pleasure and the least amount of harm for all of humanity. And like you said, that's almost an empirical thing. That's almost a thing that can be assessed by science, almost, right?
Sure, yeah.
And that might be, yeah, you might be a utilitarian. Peter Singer is a utilitarian. But again, there are good arguments for utilitarianism, and there are, I think, good counter arguments. And I think I would leave it up to you to try to be as non-biased as possible and say, hey, I just want to get to the truth. Which side has more evidence to it, the utilitarian views or the non-utilitarian views? And I think
is it utilitarian in the sense that more lives as opposed to less lives? Is that the utilitarian characteristic to it? Or?
Well, it would well, that's a good point. It depends, but usually a utilitarian would say whichever action has the greatest pleasure and least harm.
Okay.
Whichever would result in that, that's the choice you should go with. I think one more thing I want to mention too, though, is that so right now the whole discussion today was trying to give you guys the tools to assess the evidence for abortion or against abortion. You might think, well, wait, this is philosophy. This is just opinions. This is just abstract thinking. It's not really evidence, right? Like we think in science. Science, I can feel it, I can taste it, I can see it, I can touch it. It's tangible. But philosophy is so in outer space. It just seems like opinionated mental exercises or something.
Abstract, yeah.
Right. But I think that's exactly what it's not supposed to be. It's exactly what it's trying to do is clarify. So, for example, the ways that scientists define abortion, or not abortion, excuse me, evidence. Evidence is something that raises the probability of one hypothesis being true over another. And if that's the definition, which is standard in science, well, guess what? That same exact definition can be used in the moral sphere, right? We can assess the probability of all these arguments and say, which one of these arguments is most likely to be true? Which one of these hypotheses, the pro-life position or the pro-choice position, which one is most likely to be true given someone who's done their homework and given someone who's tried to be as non-biased as when assessing the arguments. That's philosophers, that's how they go about being scientific about it. They do try to weigh the evidence and the probabilities. And like I said, it's a huge exercise in being okay with being wrong. You have to say, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. It's okay to be wrong. Let me see where the evidence leads. Let me see where the truth leads. If I'm being honest with myself, what do I think is really the most probable position to hold?
I guess just a personal question for you really quick. Do you believe the evidence, I know you mentioned you're pro-life, but do you believe the evidence is overwhelming, like overwhelmingly better, for lack of better words, for the pro-life as opposed to pro-choice? Or is there do you believe that both have good arguments, but you're leaning towards pro-life, or is it clear cut?
I think before I looked into the evidence, I was a little bit more gung-ho and no abortion whatsoever, right? But I think after looking into some of the violinist arguments and some of the thought experiments, it makes me push back and kind of say, maybe in certain cases like rape, maybe in certain cases like the mother's life, I couldn't impose that upon some other woman given these arguments. But I think that sanctity of human life, that religious argument that I also have to take into consideration because I am religious, that just again pushes even more back the probability for the pro-life position. So I think when I add that in, I think it is overwhelming for the pro-life position. But if I were to take that out, I would say it's maybe like a 60-40 split in favor of the pro-life position. Maybe 55-45.
Okay, so Celine, you had a question, and then Tyson. And Rachel, I think you want to go after that.
Yeah, I can't figure out how to raise my hand, but
I just want to say, Omar and Celine, thank you for raising your hands. It makes us all feel so much more official. I'm loving it.
it's really
But
good.
so let's go Celine, Tyson, and Rachel.
Okay. So, okay. So going back to Philip, what you were saying about kind of thinking about both scopes of the options from your religious point of view, but then also your moral conscience and how that would affect a woman. And going back to Judith Jarvis and the violinist analogy, how let's say that this woman is now tied to this fetus for 9 months. In reality, 9 months is only the beginning of the journey. The repercussions on her body are going to last so much longer after 9 months, and then maybe there's even a lifetime of repercussions that will come after that. And it's interesting that there are more men in this panel than women. Just wanted to point that out. But do you think that maybe you said that from a non-religious point of view, the evidence kind of is a 60-40 towards kind of seeing all of the choices. How do you think that this perspective would affect a non-religious woman who had to endure giving her body to something that someone, or however we define it? How do you think that what I'm trying to explain is your perspective as a man who is religious is pro-life and to not abort this baby, and a woman who's non-religious who has to then endure the lifetime of repercussions is also different. So how would your say have superiority to her, the consequences that she would have to face?
That's a good question. I think there's something to be said that men will just not be in that situation. And there is something sort of intuitive to ask the question, like, why would we allow men to decide these things for women? You know, women are dealing with this, not men. But I think this is also subject to counterexamples. I mean, Roe v. Wade was the big Supreme Court justice case that, in a sense, legalized federally abortion, but that was decided by 9 men. And so I think if you're going to say men don't have a say or have less of a say, I mean, it just seems obviously false, because what's moral doesn't depend upon your sex, right? To know what's the truth, right? This is something that is evidence-based. To know what is the case is doesn't depend upon you being someone. It just depends upon you having personhood, a mind, rationality, being able to think through these things. But yeah, like if there was a woman who, let's say, was raped and carried this child to term and was traumatized and maybe had terrible repercussions from it, I wouldn't slam her with arguments from Don Marquis, unless they were willing to know why unless she was willing to know why I hold this view. I wouldn't even bring that into the discussion. I wouldn't. I'm not here to slam a view in someone's face, and this is just here if someone wants to try to look into the views as non-biasedly as possible. And not everyone's ready for that discussion. Not everyone's ready to let go of the beliefs they have, and that's true with even things like God. Maybe there are good arguments that God doesn't exist, and they're worthy of our consideration. And not everyone's ready to hear that. Not everyone's ready to look into that. But I think it's smart to be well informed and not to be dogmatic, right? Because we can just dig our feet in the sand and say, I'm pro-life because I'm pro-life, because I'm religious, and because my parents are pro-life, and same thing on the other side. I'm pro-choice because I'm not religious, and my parents aren't. But that's not helping anybody. The discussion can be brought together by considering these arguments, I think. But yeah, I mean, it's again, it's like you said, it's a sticky situation. It's tough. There could be complications, but also there could be complications in abortion too. Women who have abortions are less likely to, or it's not as easy for them to get pregnant again, and they can have, they're at a higher risk for breast cancer, believe it or not, and other complications. And there was a study done in I believe Sweden, where women who had abortions were, 3 times more likely to be depressed or have suicide or X, Y, and Z. And that might not necessarily be because of the abortion. That might be because of how it's looked upon or something like that. But still, there are also problems that could arise from having the abortion, just as there are problems that could arise from not. But the question is, we should make decisions based on what's true, not based on what makes us a certain way or makes us feel a certain way or based on emotion. We should make our decisions because something is factual or evidential. That's kind of tough, and we don't all do that. I don't, but I think we should try.
I think, Celine, to your point, I mean, I agree that the pro-life movement is so myopic when it comes to like, just don't kill the kid, and it I wouldn't say ever, it rarely ever accommodates the mental health of the mom or helping the mom then afterwards, or what does it look like relationally between the family members and the dad. Like, it can get very emotional when it comes, or it is always going to be very emotional unless you sat down with someone who's been in that seat and is making this hard decision to have this abortion or to not. It is an emotional thing. So it's great to talk about it in this light where we're able to discuss it in a philosophical
Right.
format and have arguments for it. But when it's a person that you know and like it becomes a real thing that you're having to engage with, it definitely is a whole different kind of person. So I like how compassionate I feel like you're being in your rebuttals about what like applying these viewpoints to a person. What does that mean? So I think that's really good, but just again, I don't think that negates like Phil was saying, like morals, or when it comes to like what's a moral wrong, or something that's morally wrong to do to a person, even if it's potentially difficult for another.
I just wanted to add one more thing because Rachel brought this up earlier about like soul building. I believe soul building theodicy she was referring to. It's kind of like the same thing with when you're discussing like the problem of suffering. That's another philosophical question. When you're discussing people suffering and tortures and drug addiction and loss of life and stuff like that, one of the best arguments against God, the existence of God, is the problem of evil and suffering. And you can give answers. Oh, well, soul building. Oh, well, you'll be compensated in heaven. Oh, well, free will. Oh, but like, I think Celine is kind of advocating for like, well, how compassionate is that to someone who's actually suffering? Like, oh, just like, it's all right. Like, yeah, you're suffering, but like, God, don't worry. God is like using this for good. Don't worry. I don't know if that's really helpful. Or oh no, don't worry about this evil. God is still here. It's just the free will of man, and it's just just the devil, and you know what I mean. It's kind of like, do the people who are suffering, do they need like logical arguments and a showdown, or do they just need to be comforted? You know, it's because these are two separate things, right? The philosophical arguments are supposed to remove us from the emotions so that we can see clearly, right? But when people are actually in it, the emotions are high, and it's tough to see it. And we shouldn't slam them with arguments or quick solutions,
Yeah.
Can I just say thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm just super happy that everyone is still up. It's kind of late, so and for people who don't normally come to this meeting, we meet every Wednesday. So there's familiar faces, not familiar faces. Everyone is asking really thoughtful, great questions. And this is an issue that is very contentious, very emotional. and nobody has flared up or anything. So that's been great. I just want to say thank you for that. Thank you for coming and being respectful of people's time. We will be ending soon. So I'm going to let people ask any remaining questions. I think I saw Teresa, you had your hand up, and Tyson. Tyson, you can go first, and then Teresa. But just so you know, we will be ending soon for anyone who needs to go to bed.
Mhm.
Okay.
Tyson. Yeah.
Thanks, Sam. Appreciate that. Yeah. I'm trying to remember what I was going to say. But yeah. Okay. Like what you guys are saying about, if someone gets raped and like they want to have an abortion, I'm not going to be the one to tell them like, hey, like, don't do it, because I'm a guy. I'm not gonna. That's never gonna happen to me. You know, I'm never gonna like be able to feel like what they're going through. So I think it's important like to show compassion, show grace to those people who are dealing with things that we can deal with, and that goes for this situation and every situation ever. But I think it's something I still wrestle with too. Like, if someone gets raped, like in my head, I'm just like, why would they want to have that baby? Like, and I'm not even talking from a philosophical standpoint. I'm just talking from just a purely emotional, like, realistic standpoint. Like, what would be actually going through their head if they're being abused and like sexually assaulted, raped, and they have to carry that child of their rapist inside of them for 9 months and then carry it fully until it's like alive. You know, like I still wrestle with that. So I know that's tough for me. And I think the violence argument was pretty interesting as well.
Yeah.
But like in my head, I'm thinking of a scenario like, what if the woman agrees to like be latched to this violinist for 9 months? Like, is at that point, is she morally obligated?
Yeah.
You know, like at that point,
Yeah.
she's morally obligated to be linked up with this violinist for 9 months, like, or can she just like back out at any moment because like, oh, it's her body, she can do whatever she wants, even though she like
Yeah.
knew what she was getting into before she was getting into it. Because if I'm latched up to some guy when I wake up, I don't think I'm gonna want to like.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, like, I don't know. I'm just trying to think.
Yeah.
I'm trying to be reasonable, like, and I'm not like. I'm trying to be as understanding and as gracious as I can be with this. Obviously, I know. Yeah, whatever. I'll stop. I know other people got stuff to say, but
I'll just say I share your intuition. I don't think I would want to stay hooked up to that guy either. You know, if I'm being honest, that's my intuition. But yeah, I think going back to what you said in the beginning, you're right. Like, if a woman gets raped, like it's just, man, it's just horrible. Like it's not a time for philosophical arguments. It's not a time for, well, this is wrong and this is because of this argument. The future deprivation account. It's like, relax. Like it's the same thing with the problem of evil. If someone's kid dies, I think it'd be inappropriate to be like, oh, dude, don't be upset at that. It's for the greater good because God is a good God and it's for the greater good. It's like that, that might even be true. That might even be true, right? But I don't know if that's the best thing to say to somebody who just lost their kid, But your question was if they consent to attaching. That was the same exact example that David Boonin gave with the bone marrow case. Because the guy initially said, yeah, I'll donate it. But I don't know, maybe he went home, looked it up, was like, oh, dude, that's going to be painful. I don't want the complications of it. And then he was like, last second, no, I'm not going to donate the bone marrow. And the court ruled. They said, well, like, okay, maybe this guy is like a little mean or something, but he's not doing anything immoral and he's not doing anything illegal. Like, we don't have a right to this man's bone marrow, to his body, So that was the moral of the story for the bone marrow analogy. I think it shows that even if you consent at one point, but then choose later not to consent, it still doesn't give someone a right to your body.
Yeah, and can I just say one last thing, and I'm done. I promise. I think maybe like the only other thing I was thinking of is like if that woman wakes up next to the dying violinist, and I guess like is moved by what she sees and has like deep compassion for the guy, then she'll stay connected. Like maybe that's the same type of thing. Like if a woman gets raped and then has compassion on the baby, she'll then think like, I'm gonna carry this to term. You know, like if she, I don't know. I guess that's the
Well,
biggest thing.
I've listened to some interviews of women who were in that situation, and some of their conclusions were basically just like this: what is killing my fetus going to do for me for the fact that I was raped? You know, what does that actually solve? Many of them say that, at least in some of these interviews I've seen. And so, yeah, it's a consideration.
And Tyson, just to piggyback off of that, it's not even a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Regardless on how often we try to stop it, and no matter how long we talk about abortion, rape is rape. And unfortunately, women get pregnant because of it. One of my coworkers was raped and got pregnant, and she kept her baby because at the end of the day, her baby didn't do anything wrong. It was the rapist that hurt her. They did that wrong. They tracked down her rapist. He went to jail. They have a relationship with him, but he is not legally allowed to be with her or the daughter alone. So there's, we can talk about the hypotheticals and the ifs, but afterwards there's all the legality with it. And then to Celine and Rachel and Philip's point earlier, when you have a friend that's raped, or you have a friend that, has an unwanted pregnancy and they want to get an abortion, you can't just say, oh, that's wrong because this, that, and the other. Because if it is a situation where she was raped, or if her boyfriend and her consented to sex, but he not consensual, and then she says, well, I want an abortion, I didn't plan this. You can't say, oh, that's wrong to get an abortion, because in that moment, it almost justifies the wrong that was done to them. And that's not what we're trying to do. So to your point, taking the if out of it and putting it as a when kind of makes it more real. Because like Philip and Tyson's point, unfortunately with this, men only carry but so much of the decision making when it comes to pregnancy and abortion. Y'all have a lot before and after, but the 9 months, and then with women, once they have the baby, they're always postpartum. They're never considered prepartum. Completely changed, their hormones have changed. They carry that on for the rest of their lives. Men, it's like it never happened. So I guess to bring your point, like it depends on the woman, and I guess how she's able to cope with that situation. But then with Selena's and Philip and everyone, the amount of compassion that you want to address that with is, and I feel like everyone's been like really hitting home on the, regardless of what's happened, you still have to be compassionate, which is great.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I think Celine had her hand up, and then Omar.
I was just thinking about the question that was asked earlier. I don't remember who asked it, but it couldn't be answered concretely because it was just so complex. It was, is there a right to kill something or someone that can cause harm to others, like serious harm to others? And then going back to the logic of what if someone has personhood, is it then wrong to abort or to kill? I was just wondering what the stance for the death penalty is for most pro-lifers, and if there is any thing that can kind of correlate to whether or not that's wrong by that logic, or because they aren't innocent, that it would be considered morally okay. I don't know. I have no stance. I just wanted to hear if anyone could speak to that.
Yeah, I know that comes up, especially in the popular debate. People will often accuse someone of the pro-life position of inconsistency because many of them are conservatives, many of them are okay with the death penalty. And yeah, I think all they're gonna say is, well, it's an innocent human being versus a not innocent human being. But yeah, these views, what depending on what you take, human being view, personhood view, future like ours view, that might affect that stance. You might have to change your stance. Say, you know what, I'm not capital punishment. I don't think I should kill this person because they're made in the image of God. They have human sanctity and they're sacred, or they are they have personhood and they have a right to life, or what have you. So yeah, that's an interesting consideration. These views will affect not just what your view is on abortion, but it'll affect euthanasia and capital punishment.
Yeah.
And then I had one more thing, if it's all right. Okay, I wrote this down while you guys were talking, and I thought it was such a dumb question, but I was relieved when you brought it up because I thought, okay, I'm not crazy. But I was just thinking about Pico della Miranda's chain of being theory and how human life is a gift, and it should only be granted and taken by God. So kind of just saying like that it is given by God and should be taken by God, and that humans ranks in this chain of being as superior. I wrote my question saying, would prevention of contraception be considered morally wrong too then, because you are interfering with the creation of life that would biologically happen on its own?
Right.
So I wrote that down. I was like, I'm not asking this because it seems absurd. And then you mentioned it. I was like, okay, it's not totally.
Well,
Yeah.
just for the record, most conservatives, or at least Catholic conservatives, are against contraceptives. So yeah, Phil, you can answer that.
Yeah, so in Denmark, he's in his article here. Let me pull it up.
The one I have right here sitting next to my desk.
In the very back.
Printed out.
This is what he says. He says, the strongest objection to the future like ours argument, this future deprivation, his future deprivation account, is contraception. He says, and that's what I brought up in the PowerPoint, right? I said, are you depriving future individuals of a good future? And I didn't really give you his answer of how he responds to that, but I guess I will because you asked. But he basically says, look, all my account says is not that you need to make more people with the most features that are valuable, but that you shouldn't prevent individuals that are already here from a future that's valuable. And he says the sperm and the egg, first of all, they're not individuals that, if left to their own devices, will potentially become individuals with valuable futures. Only when they come together and a human embryo is formed does now it have the potential for that. So he would say contraception is fine and it doesn't do anything to harm my view. Now, I'm sure there are tons of responses to that in the literature and tons of responses to the responses in the literature, but I think that's about as far as I know how to, what's been said about that.
I hope that's encouraging. I don't know if you caught that, Celine, but the question that you thought was dumb was what the philosopher thought was one of the strongest objections to his view. So give yourself a little bit more credit. You're asking really valuable questions.
And definitely not dumb questions.
Not dumb questions.
Yeah. Okay, I think Omar had a question. And then maybe after, or maybe not, I don't know.
Sorry.
But we're going to start wrapping up. Maybe like the last questions, if anyone has any last questions for Phil, or just comments in general.
Mom, did you raise your hand?
Oh, I really enjoyed sitting in on this. And one of the reasons that I wanted to, and Rachel knows that I'm actually against abortion. And but I put my money where my mouth is, basically. I actually volunteer at a crisis pregnancy center. and actually go in and actually work with these ladies on how they can keep their babies and how they can put them up for adoptions and all the different other choices they have. And I know that I don't believe that we're ever going to get to a point where we don't have abortion in the world, but I want to do the part that I can play to prevent as many as possible. It's like throwing that starfish back into the ocean. You know, I can't save all of them, but if I can do one at a time, let's do that. And so I think that's cool. But as you talk about your philosophies and how you believe and what you want to do, and you choose a viewpoint, all I'm asking you to do is something about it. Like make a choice of how you'd like to be involved to make a difference in where you stand.
Yeah, I think that's awesome, and I think that's even kind of what Omar was trying to say earlier too. Like, there should be a practical aspect to all this. All this philosophy can be so abstract and in your head, but in the end of the day, it should make a difference practically what you do and the decisions you make. So that's really cool. And I know there's a lot of individuals who are trying to be more consistent and put their money where their mouth is too. They say, yeah, you know, we're against abortion, but hey, we're going to sit down with the woman and provide the healthcare, and we'll take her to her appointments. We'll adopt the baby. We'll bring it to term. And yeah, I think that's pretty cool. So thanks for that.
One question I had was I feel like when I think about abortion, it seems like no parties involved think they just went through an act that they wanted. Like the party, let's say you're pro-choice, and let's say you're the mother. It's an unwanted child. It's an unwanted occurrence. You did not want to be pregnant, or moreover, you just don't have the means, and that's not a good thing. We would all, of course, want the means to raise a child and all these considerations. And I guess I can't help but think that if it's not good for anyone involved, regardless of the view you have on the matter, shouldn't that be evidence for the fact that it's just a bad occurrence? What is, like, that seems to pick my intuitions that the event that just occurred is bad. And I think you kind of pointed to that with some of the effects after you have an abortion. Like, if you're just sort of thinking like, okay, let's say, like, let's assume that the pro-choice position is true. What would you expect from an abortion? And it seems like I wouldn't expect all these negative things to happen. I wouldn't expect, you know, her attitude going into it being like, this is just terrible. I don't want to have this. You know, all these reasons people are giving are situations that we don't want to have. And I feel like everyone should look at the situation sort of like something bad just happened, something that we would like to have less of just happened. So I guess maybe I'm just kind of rambling at this point, but that's sort of what I think. Like, I almost wonder if people can kind of come together and be like, I mean, do you think that's an area where people can come to better and say like, we should want less abortions all around?
Well, yeah. So I mean, you tell me. I have two thoughts on that. So like, number one, rights. Like, it's an uncomfortable situation for everyone. No one's like, oh yeah, I'm getting an abortion. You know, like it's just it costs money too for the woman. It costs time. It's a procedure that probably isn't the most comfortable. Like, you know, it's nobody really wants it. But I think though, on the other side, you know, cake tastes really good, but doesn't mean it's good for you. You know, exercise is really tough and it hurts. And it's not fun sometimes, but it's good for you, you know? So maybe there's some kind of pragmatic argument there that like what we enjoy is generally moral, but there's some clear counter examples to that. But yeah, that's my thought.
Can I jump in on this one?
Please.
So, I mean, yeah, like nobody's having an abortion necessarily wants to have one, but I think that just saying that it's bad and it shouldn't happen is missing the point that it's bad, but to them it is better than the alternative. So it's still better than carrying that child to term. I think that that's missing that entire part of that argument. And there's a study that you should look into called the Turnaway study. And it was a study where 1,132 women were taken from waiting rooms of 30 abortion clinics. and they were interviewed 2 times a year for 5 years. And 95% of the women who had the abortion said it was the best choice that they made for them 5 years after. So I think that like saying that like all people that have the abortion are going to end up miserable or regretting it, I don't think that that's necessarily true. And actually a lot of the women that were denied the abortion were the ones that had suffering mental health condition as well. So it's a good study to look into as well.
Yeah, I think to add to that, again, I mentioned in the beginning that 88% of all abortions worldwide are in developing countries. You know, people who, in a global perspective, are disadvantaged, do have less money, do have less resources. And so they're going to be the most affected by our policies and our stances and our arguments, really. So yeah, it's a good point.
Cool. Let me just give a moment to, I think that's all the questions we'll do for now. It's late. I wanted people to sort of, you know, it's late, so go to bed and all that stuff. I'm really thankful for everyone being here. But Phil, I just want to give you an opportunity. Give us your opinion. I want to hear your controversial opinion. What do you think of all the arguments? Like, what is sort of your conclusion? What argument do you like best, and why?
Yeah, I think I think Omar asked me this earlier too. I think when I look at these arguments and I try to be honest with myself, I really do struggle to find what's wrong with the impairment argument by Perry Hendricks. Like, if it's wrong to give it a fetus fetal alcohol syndrome, it's wrong to do something worse than give them fetal alcohol syndrome, like kill them. And so I struggle to find a convincing counter objection to that argument. But at the same time, where I used to think, you know, I used to be so like, oh, well, even if a woman's raped, she needs to have the kid. Now I struggle to find what's wrong with the violinist argument to say that if she wants to unplug, she could, because it's, you know, she was kidnapped. She was just connected to these wires and unable to even consent to that. So I think I can't really refute that. I have a difficult time refuting that. And the only way for me to refute that would be to rely on some sort of, like we said, sanctity of human life type of argument. So yeah, I guess in the end, like I said, I'd probably give it, without religion in the mix, just going by my pure reasoning. And again, I'm nobody. I'm not an expert, and I'm not some kind of genius, and my opinion doesn't really matter. But if I had to look at all the arguments, I would say it's probably 60-40 apart from religion in favor of the pro-life position. But the religion, if you add that in there, it'll raise it even more for the pro-life position. But again, that's just my assessment. I could be absolutely wrong. You know, some smarter philosopher, in some university elsewhere, he's probably looked at all the arguments and said, dude, you're just like clearly 90-10 in favor of pro-choice. So, you know, that's just me when I try to be objective and honest with myself.
Well, what you're also doing is, I think a lot of times, especially out in the real world, we don't really take our opponents seriously. We sort of straw man, make their arguments worse, all that stuff. And you're very honest saying, listen, some of these arguments I still don't know how to respond to. But if I'm being like objective and honest with myself, if I'm putting like a percentage on it, I lean in one direction. And I think like that's a good sort of principle to kind of go off of for everyone here tonight, is that sort of just taking your opponents seriously, like responding to the best of what they have to offer. And I think what will come from that is you're going to know the truth, hopefully, and be closer to the truth. And you're also going to land on a position that you'll be more comfortable in because you considered the best of what the opposition has to offer. And you've also been fair to them because you considered their best objections. I hope everyone tonight sort of just gets that, is critical thinking is important, seeking the truth is important, and we need to consider both arguments on both sides and try to make a judgment as fairly and as objectively as we can.
Yeah, Salim, maybe last comment. One thing I just want to say before I get off is that that's kind of the goal of this whole group and how it got started, is we want to do our best to understand different worldviews that people have. And naturally from this group, we do apply a Christian worldview towards those viewpoints. However, it is really good to understand what you believe, but also very important to understand what someone else has to believe also, and why they believe that and why they think that that is a valid belief to hold. And again, like Sam was saying, not strawman somebody in order to take them apart. So please come back. That's the goal of this group. Sometimes we I personally don't always hit it. I just want to be right. But that's the goal, is to get to a point where you can, land 60-40, or, maybe sometimes on certain topics you are 90-10. But Celine, you have another comment to make.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think you guys did a phenomenal job in organizing this, and I've personally felt very safe to say my opinions and to bring questions. I didn't feel like there was any, I don't know, it just felt safe, and I just wanted to say it was a very welcoming group, and thank you.
Well, thank you.
And piggyback off that, you matter, so your opinion matters, and you are very smart. So it was really nice being able to listen to you. So
Thank you. I appreciate that.
absolutely.
I had a question really quick for Melissa. Could you just repeat the name of that study again? I wanted to look more into that.
Yeah, it's the Turnaway study. I think it was done.
Turnaway, you said?
Yeah, Turnaway.
I'm writing that down. Turnaway study. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, just so you guys know, we have these meetings every Wednesday at 8:30 EST, and we'd love to see more of you come. We've been going through a lot of issues in applied ethics. We talked about the death penalty, euthanasia, critical race theory, and if you felt welcomed here, I hope that you consider coming again, because I think Phil will also try coming often, so you get to pick his brain more about abortion if you want. So yeah, I think that's it. I'm gonna let you guys go to bed. I'm sure a lot of us have work in the morning or something important to do in the morning. So thank you all for being here. This was great. Wow, we went for a very long time.
2 hours and 40 minutes.
Yeah.
Don't always go this late. Sometimes we only go to 9:30, and then we fall asleep. So it's okay. So
Okay.
Don't think that you have to tap in for 2 hours and 40 minutes next time.
Yeah. Okay.
Also,
if anyone would like to join, the regular meeting group, we have a group me. You can shoot me a message on here, and I can figure out how to add
whoever
you
you got invited through, we'll add you. Or if you have potential topics you want to discuss, Celine mentioned the death penalty, and we've discussed that in the past. So if there are things like that you want to discuss, we can do that. But let me pray us out, and then we can close. Okay, Lord Jesus, thank you so much for this technology and being able to communicate. Thank you for different people that have different skills that they can bring to a group. Thank you for creating us all individuals with different thoughts and ideas and how I perceive the world. Again, just really thankful for this group and for you for creating each and every one of us. Let us sleep well tonight and get to work on time in the morning. In Jesus' name, amen.
Bye, guys.
Good night.
Nice.